You should definitely know these facts because they are very important history. Ancient rats, the hidden force that shaped civilizations. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. Long before the first stone was laid upon the first great monument of human civilization, long before the earliest kings carved their names into temple walls, long before scribes pressed reeds into wet clay to record the affairs of empires, there existed a creature so resilient, so adaptable, and so profoundly intertwined with the fate of humankind that its story cannot be separated from our own. That creature is the rat. And its ancient history is one of the most remarkable, most overlooked, and most consequential chapters in the entire saga of life on this planet. We begin not in the age of empires, not in the age of bronze, not even in the age of agriculture. We begin in a time so remote, so unimaginably distant from the world we know today, that the very continents themselves wore different faces. We begin in the age of the dinosaurs, in the Cretaceous period, roughly 100 million years ago, when the earliest ancestors of all rodents first appeared on the earth. These were not rats as any ancient person would have recognized them. They were tiny, shrew-like mammals, scurrying beneath the feet of giants, hiding in burrows and beneath rotting logs, surviving on insects and seeds, and whatever morsels the great reptilian overlords of the world left behind. They were insignificant in almost every measurable way. They were small, they were fragile, they were prey, and yet they possessed something that the mighty dinosaurs did not. They possessed an extraordinary, almost supernatural capacity to adapt, to endure, to survive catastrophe after catastrophe after catastrophe. When the great asteroid struck the Earth approximately 66 million years ago, ending the reign of the dinosaurs in a cataclysm of fire and darkness and cold, these tiny ancestors of the rat survived. They survived because they were small enough to hide. They survived because they could eat almost anything. They survived because their bodies required so little energy to sustain. And when the smoke cleared, when the skies brightened again, when the world began its long, slow recovery from the greatest extinction event since the death of the Permian seas, these little creatures emerged from their burrows and their hiding places and found a world emptied of its former rulers. And they began to multiply, and they began to diversify, and they began to spread across every landmass, every island, every corner of the recovering earth. The order Rodentia, to which all rats belong, is believed to have formally diverged from other mammalian lineages sometime during the late Cretaceous or very early Paleocene epoch, between 65 and 70 million years ago. The fossil record from this period is incomplete, as one would expect given the extraordinary passage of time involved, but paleontologists have pieced together a remarkable picture of how these early rodent ancestors evolved. The oldest known rodent fossils come from the Paleocene epoch, roughly 60 million years ago, and they have been found in what is now Asia. These early rodents were already showing the characteristic features that would define their descendants for tens of millions of years to come, most notably the continuously growing incisor teeth that are the hallmark of every rodent species alive today. Those teeth, those remarkable self-sharpening, ever-growing incisors, were perhaps the single greatest evolutionary innovation in the history of small mammals. They allowed rodents to gnaw through hard seeds, through tough plant material, through bark and wood and even bone. They were tools of extraordinary versatility, and they gave the earliest rodents an advantage over competing small mammals that would prove decisive over the long course of evolutionary time. The family Muridae, which includes the true rats and mice, is one of the largest and most successful families of mammals ever to have existed. Its origins are ancient, stretching back at least 25 million years into the Oligocene and Miocene epochs, when the great grasslands of the world were first spreading across the continents. The earliest members of this family were small, mouse-like creatures that inhabited the forests and forest edges of ancient Asia. Over millions of years, they diversified into an astonishing array of species, colonizing every habitat from tropical rainforests to arid deserts to high mountain meadows. Some grew larger, some grew smaller, some became burrowers, some became climbers, some became swimmers, but all of them retained the core characteristics that had made their ancestors so successful. Those ever-growing teeth, that remarkable reproductive rate, and that almost limitless adaptability. The genus Rattus, the true rats, first appeared in the fossil record of Southeast Asia sometime during the late Miocene or early Pliocene epoch, roughly 5 to 8 million years ago. This was a time of profound environmental change across the globe. The climate was cooling. The great tropical forests that had once stretched across much of Asia were retreating, replaced by grasslands, savannas, and more open woodlands. For the ancestors of the true rats, this was an opportunity. They adapted to these new, more open environments with remarkable speed. They became larger and more robust than their mouse-like ancestors. They became more omnivorous, capable of eating an even wider range of foods. They became more social, living in larger groups and developing more complex behaviors. And they became, in a word, more successful. The two species of rat that would go on to have the greatest impact on human civilization, the black rat and the brown rat, both trace their origins to this ancient Asian homeland. The black rat, known to science as Rattus rattus, is the older of the two species, having diverged from the common rat ancestor perhaps 2 to 3 million years ago. It was originally a creature of the tropical and subtropical forests of southern Asia, a nimble climber that spent much of its time in the canopy, feeding on fruits, seeds, and insects. The brown rat, Rattus norvegicus, diverged somewhat later, evolving in the cooler, more temperate regions of northern China and Mongolia. It was a heavier, more ground-dwelling creature, better adapted to burrowing and to surviving in harsh, cold environments. Both species were extraordinarily successful in their original habitats, but it was their encounter with human beings that would transform them from ordinary rodents into something far more significant, something almost mythological in its scope and consequence. The story of rats and humans begins with the dawn of agriculture, that momentous revolution in human affairs that transformed scattered bands of nomadic hunter-gatherers into settled communities of farmers and herders. This revolution began approximately 10 to 12,000 years ago in the region known as the Fertile Crescent, that arc of relatively well-watered and fertile land stretching from the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia through the Levant and into the Nile Valley of Egypt. When the first humans began to plant crops, to harvest grain, and to store their surplus in granaries and storage pits, they unwittingly created a paradise for rats. For the first time in the history of life on Earth, there existed concentrated, easily accessible stores of food, gathered together in one place, protected from the elements, and largely undefended against a creature as clever and as determined as the rat. The archaeological evidence for this ancient partnership, if one can call it that, between rats and early agricultural communities is both compelling and abundant. Excavations at some of the oldest known agricultural settlements in the Fertile Crescent have revealed rat bones mixed in with the remains of stored grain, the detritus of daily life, and the bones of other animals that were drawn to these early human communities. At the site of Çatalhöyük in what is now central Turkey, one of the oldest and largest known Neolithic settlements in the world, dating back roughly 9,000 years, archaeologists have found evidence of rodent activity throughout the settlement's long history of occupation. Rat and mouse bones have been recovered from storage areas, from domestic living spaces, and from the refuse heaps that accumulated around the edges of the settlement. The people of Çatalhöyük, it seems, lived in close and constant proximity to rats from the very beginning of their settled existence. Similar evidence has been found at other ancient sites across the Near East. At Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, rat remains have been found in layers dating back more than 8,000 years. At Abu Hureyra in what is now Syria, a site that preserves evidence of the transition from hunting and gathering to farming, rodent bones appear in the archaeological record at precisely the moment when the inhabitants began to cultivate and store cereal grains. The The pattern is unmistakable and has been confirmed at dozens of sites across the ancient world. Wherever humans began to farm, wherever they began to store grain, wherever they began to build permanent settlements, rats followed. They followed not because they were drawn to humans themselves, but because they were drawn to the concentrated food resources that human agriculture created. In a very real sense, the rat was one of the first and most successful colonizers of the human-built environment. The ancient Sumerians, who built the first true cities in the fertile floodplains of southern Mesopotamia more than 5,000 years ago, were intimately familiar with rats. The Sumerians were in many ways the inventors of civilization as we understand it. They created the first written language, the first codified systems of law, the first complex bureaucracies, and the first large-scale systems of irrigation and agriculture. And they also had to contend with rats. Sumerian texts, written in the wedge-shaped cuneiform script on tablets of damp clay, contain numerous references to rodents and the damage they caused. The Sumerians had specific words for rats and mice in their language, and they wrote about the destruction these creatures wrought upon their grain stores, their food supplies, and their homes. One of the most fascinating Sumerian texts relating to rats is a literary composition sometimes called the debate between the hoe and the plow, a genre of Sumerian literature in which two objects or animals argue about which of them is more important. While rats are not the central characters in this particular text, the broader corpus of Sumerian agricultural literature makes it abundantly clear that rodent pests were a constant concern for the farmers and administrators of the Sumerian city-states. The great granaries of of Uruk, of Lagash, and of Nippur were vital to the survival of these cities, and protecting them from rats and other pests was a matter of the highest importance. Administrative texts record the quantities of grain stored, the quantities lost to spoilage and pests, and the measures taken to protect the stores. These measures included the construction of raised platforms to keep grain off the damp ground, the use of sealed clay vessels for storage, and perhaps most significantly, the keeping of cats. The relationship between cats and rats in the ancient world is one of the great ecological dramas of human history, and it began in the earliest days of agriculture. Wild cats, drawn by the abundance of rodents that infested the granaries and storage facilities of the first farming communities, began to frequent human settlements. The humans, recognizing the value of these natural rodent hunters, tolerated their presence and even encouraged it. Over time, this mutually beneficial arrangement led to the domestication of the cat, one of the most consequential events in the history of the human relationship with animals. The earliest evidence for cat domestication comes from the island of Cyprus, where a cat was deliberately buried alongside a human approximately 9,500 years ago, and from sites in the Fertile Crescent dating back roughly 10,000 years. In every case, the domestication of the cat appears to have been driven, at least in part, by the need to control rodent populations in and around human food stores. The ancient rat, in a very real sense, was responsible for bringing the cat into human life. In ancient Egypt, the relationship between rats, cats, and humans reached its most elaborate and culturally significant expression. The ancient Egyptians were, above all else, an agricultural people. Their entire civilization was built upon the annual flood of the Nile River, which deposited rich, fertile silt across the floodplain, creating some of the most productive farmland in the ancient world. The grain harvests of Egypt were legendary, and the granaries of the pharaohs were among the largest and most carefully managed in the ancient Near East. Protecting these vast stores of grain from rats and other pests was a matter of national importance, and the Egyptians devoted considerable resources and ingenuity to the task. The Egyptians were well aware of the destructive potential of rats. Tomb paintings, temple reliefs, and papyrus documents from across the long span of Egyptian history contain references to rodents and the damage they caused. In the medical papyri of ancient Egypt, some of which date back more than 3,500 years, there are references to diseases and ailments that may have been associated with rat-borne pathogens, although the Egyptians did not understand the mechanism of disease transmission as we do today. In the agricultural texts, there are instructions for the construction and maintenance of granaries, including specific measures designed to keep rodents out. These measures included the use of thick mud brick walls, raised stone foundations, small and easily sealed entrance ways, and the placement of cats within or near the granary buildings. The cat held a position of extraordinary reverence in ancient Egyptian culture, and much of that reverence can be traced directly to the cat's role as a protector of the grain supply. The goddess Bastet, one of the most popular and widely worshipped deities in the Egyptian pantheon, was depicted as a cat or as a woman with the head of a cat. Bastet was a goddess of home, fertility, and protection, and her association with the domestic cat reflected the vital protective role that cats played in Egyptian households and granaries. The killing of a cat in ancient Egypt was considered a serious crime, and there are accounts from ancient writers, including the Greek historian Herodotus, of Egyptians going to extraordinary lengths to protect cats. Herodotus reported that when a house caught fire in Egypt, the people were more concerned with saving the cats than with extinguishing the flames. While this account may contain some exaggeration, it reflects the genuine importance that the Egyptians attached to cats, and by extension, the genuine threat that rats posed to their way of life. Archaeological excavations at ancient Egyptian sites have revealed extensive evidence of rat activity. At the workers' village of Deir el-Medina, near the Valley of the Kings, where the artisans and laborers who constructed the royal tombs lived for generations, rat bones have been found in domestic contexts, mixed in with the remains of food, household goods, and other debris. The workers of Deir el-Medina were supplied with grain rations by the state, and protecting those rations from rats must have been a daily concern. Similar evidence has been found at other Egyptian settlements, from the great cities of Memphis and Thebes to the smaller towns and villages of the Nile Delta and the Fayum. The ancient Egyptians also encountered rats in a context that was uniquely their own, the context of mummification and burial. The tombs of the pharaohs and the nobility were stocked with food offerings intended to sustain the deceased in the afterlife. These offerings included bread, beer, meat, fruit, and grain, all of which were attractive to rats. There is evidence that rats infiltrated some ancient Egyptian tombs, gnawing on the food offerings and even in some cases on the wrappings and remains of the mummies themselves. Tomb builders went to considerable lengths to seal the burial chambers against intrusion, but the persistence and ingenuity of the rat sometimes proved more than a match for even the most elaborate precautions. Interestingly, rats themselves were sometimes mummified in ancient Egypt, though whether this was done deliberately as a form of offering or pest control, or whether the rats simply died in the tombs and were naturally preserved by the dry conditions, is a matter of scholarly debate. Across the ancient Near East, in the civilizations of Mesopotamia, the Levant, Anatolia, and the Iranian plateau, rats were a persistent and unwelcome presence. The ancient Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, who succeeded the Sumerians as the dominant powers of Mesopotamia, all dealt with rat infestations in their cities, their granaries, and their temples. Babylonian omen texts, which were used by priests and diviners to interpret signs from the gods, include numerous references to rats and their behavior. In the Babylonian tradition, the appearance of rats in certain places or at certain times was considered an omen, a message from the divine realm that could portend good fortune or disaster. A rat gnawing on a person's belongings might be interpreted as a sign of impending financial loss. A rat entering a temple might be seen as a warning of divine displeasure. The behavior of rats was observed, recorded, and analyzed with the same seriousness and rigor that the Babylonians applied to the movements of the stars and planets. One of the most intriguing references to rats in the ancient Near Eastern literary tradition comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest and greatest works of literature in human history. In this epic, which tells the story of the legendary king of Uruk and his quest for immortality, there is a passage in which the hero Utnapishtim describes the great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. After the floodwaters recede, Utnapishtim releases a dove, a swallow, and a raven to see if the waters have subsided enough for life to return to the land. While rats are not explicitly mentioned in this passage, the broader context of the flood story, with its themes of destruction, survival, and renewal, resonates powerfully with the ecological story of the rat, a creature that has survived every catastrophe that the world has thrown at it, from asteroid impacts to floods to fires to the relentless efforts of human beings to exterminate it. The ancient Hittites, who built a powerful empire in Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, during the second millennium before the Common Era, also had to contend with rats. Hittite texts include references to rodent pests in agricultural contexts, and Hittite law codes contain provisions relating to the responsibilities of farmers and landowners to manage pests and protect stored grain. The Hittite capital of Hattusa, a great walled city perched on a rocky plateau in central Anatolia, was home to extensive granaries and storage facilities, and protecting these from rats and other pests was an ongoing concern for the Hittite administration. Moving eastward, the ancient civilizations of the Indus Valley, which flourished in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, also lived in close proximity to rats. The great cities of the Indus Valley civilization, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, were among the most sophisticated urban centers of the ancient world, with carefully planned street grids, advanced drainage systems, and large public buildings. Archaeological excavations at these sites have revealed evidence of rodent activity, including rat bones in domestic and storage contexts. The Indus Valley people, like their contemporaries in Mesopotamia and Egypt, were farmers who relied on stored grain to sustain their cities, and they would have faced the same challenges of rodent management that plagued agricultural communities everywhere in the ancient world. In ancient India, the rat occupied a unique and fascinating place in the religious and cultural imagination. The Hindu god Ganesha, one of the most beloved and widely worshipped deities in the Hindu pantheon, is traditionally depicted riding on a rat or mouse, which serves as his vahana or divine vehicle. This association between the elephant-headed god of wisdom, beginnings, and obstacle removal and the humble rat is one of the most striking and enduring images in all of Hindu iconography. The meaning of this association has been interpreted in many ways. Some scholars suggest that the rat represents the ability to overcome obstacles, gnawing through barriers just as Ganesha removes obstacles from the paths of his devotees. Others suggest that the rat represents the human ego or desire, which must be brought under control and ridden rather than allowed to run wild. Still others see the rat as a symbol of the pervasive, all-penetrating nature of the divine, which, like the rat, can find its way into every corner and crevice of existence. The association between Ganesha and the rat has deep roots in ancient Indian culture, though the precise origins of this iconographic tradition are difficult to trace. Some of the earliest depictions of Ganesha with his rat vehicle date to the medieval period of Indian history, but the underlying mythological and symbolic traditions may be considerably older. In the ancient Sanskrit texts, rats and mice are mentioned in a variety of contexts, from agricultural pest management to religious ritual to medical practice. The ancient Indian medical tradition of Ayurveda, which has roots stretching back at least 3,000 years, includes references to diseases and conditions that may have been associated with rat-borne pathogens, and Ayurvedic texts contain instructions for the preparation of remedies and preventive measures. The Karni Mata temple in Rajasthan, while its current form dates to a later period, embodies a tradition of rat veneration that has ancient roots in Indian culture. In this tradition, rats are considered sacred and are fed, protected, and revered by devotees. The temple is home to thousands of black rats, known as kabbas, which are believed to be the reincarnated souls of devotees of the goddess Karni Mata. While the temple itself is not ancient in the strictest sense, the cultural attitudes toward rats that it represents, attitudes of reverence, respect, and even worship, have deep and ancient precedents in Indian civilization. The ancient Chinese civilization, one of the oldest and most continuous in the world, had an elaborate and multifaceted relationship with rats. In the Chinese Zodiac, one of the most enduring and influential systems of symbolic classification in human history, the rat holds the first position among the 12 animal signs. According to legend, the Jade Emperor, the ruler of heaven, organized a great race to determine the order of the zodiac animals, and the rat, through a combination of cleverness and cunning, won the race by riding on the back of the ox and jumping off at the last moment to cross the finish line first. This story reflects the ancient Chinese perception of the rat as a creature of exceptional intelligence, resourcefulness, and adaptability, qualities that were both admired and feared. The origins of the Chinese zodiac are ancient, with some scholars tracing the system back to the Shang dynasty, which ruled much of northern China from roughly the 16th to the 11th century before the Common Era. The Shang dynasty is one of the earliest historically verified Chinese dynasties, known for its elaborate bronze vessels, its practice of divination using oracle bones, and its sophisticated system of writing. Whether the zodiac system in its current form existed during the Shang period is debated, but the cultural significance of animals, including rats, in Chinese symbolic thought clearly has very ancient roots. In ancient Chinese agriculture, rats were a persistent and serious pest. The fertile river valleys of the Yellow River and the Yangtze River, where Chinese civilization first took root, were among the most productive agricultural regions in the ancient world, and the granaries and storehouses of the Chinese states were vital to the survival and stability of the population. Ancient Chinese texts contain numerous references to rodent pests and the measures taken to control them. These measures included the use of traps, poisons, cats, and even dogs trained to hunt and kill rodents. The ancient Chinese also developed sophisticated methods of granary construction designed to minimize rodent infiltration, including raised platforms, sealed walls, and narrow entrances that could be easily blocked. The ancient Chinese philosophical and literary traditions contain many references to rats, often using the rat as a symbol or metaphor for various human qualities and behaviors. In the Shijing, the Book of Songs, one of the oldest collections of Chinese poetry, dating back roughly 3,000 years, there is a famous poem known as The Large Rats that uses the image of greedy, gluttonous rats as a metaphor for oppressive and exploitative rulers. The poem expresses the frustration and resentment of common people who labor to produce grain only to see it consumed by the large rats, the corrupt officials and landlords who take more than their fair share. This poem is one of the earliest known examples of the rat being used as a political symbol, a tradition that would continue throughout Chinese history and indeed throughout the history of the world. In ancient Chinese medicine, which has a history stretching back thousands of years, rats and rat-derived substances were sometimes used in medicinal preparations. The ancient Chinese Pharmacopoeia, a compendium of medicinal substances and their uses, includes entries for various rat-related materials, though the details of these entries and their efficacy are matters of historical and scientific debate. What is clear is that the ancient Chinese, like many other ancient peoples, recognized the rat as a significant presence in their environment and sought to understand and manage that presence through a combination of practical, cultural, and medical approaches. Now let us turn our attention to the ancient Mediterranean world, to the civilizations of Greece and Rome, which would shape the cultural and intellectual foundations of Western thought for millennia to come. The ancient Greeks were well acquainted with rats and mice, and these creatures appear frequently in Greek literature, mythology, and science. The Greek word for mouse, mise, is the root of the English word mussel, a linguistic connection that reflects the ancient Greek observation that the movement of muscles beneath the skin resembles the scurrying of a mouse beneath a cloth. This etymological detail, seemingly trivial, reveals the intimacy of the ancient Greek relationship with rodents, a relationship so close that the very language bore its imprint. In Greek mythology, the god Apollo, one of the most important and complex deities in the Greek pantheon, bore the epithet Smintheus, which is commonly translated as mouse god or rat god. This epithet appears in the very first book of Homer's Iliad, the foundational text of Greek literature, where the priest Chryses calls upon Apollo Smintheus to send a plague upon the Greek army besieging Troy. The origin and meaning of this epithet have been debated by scholars for centuries. Some believe it reflects an ancient cult of Apollo in which the god was worshipped as a protector against rodent plagues, a deity who could both send and avert the destruction caused by these creatures. Others suggest that it reflects a more primitive, pre-Olympian tradition in which the mouse or rat was seen as a sacred animal, perhaps even a manifestation of the divine. The connection between Apollo, Smintheus, and plague is particularly significant in light of what we now know about the role of rats in the transmission of epidemic disease. The plague that Apollo sends upon the Greeks in the Iliad is described in terms that are consistent with an epidemic disease, and while we cannot diagnose this literary plague with any certainty, the association between rats, disease, and divine punishment in the ancient Greek imagination is deeply suggestive. The ancient Greeks did not understand the mechanisms of disease transmission, did not know about bacteria or viruses or the role of fleas and rats in spreading pestilence, but they observed the correlation between the presence of rats and the outbreak of disease, and they incorporated that observation into their mythology and religious practice. The ancient Greek philosopher and naturalist Aristotle, who lived in the 4th century before the Common Era and whose works on natural history are among the most important scientific texts of the ancient world, wrote extensively about rats and mice. In his History of Animals, Aristotle described the physical characteristics, behavior, and reproductive habits of rodents with a level of detail and accuracy that is remarkable for his time. He noted the extraordinary reproductive rate of mice, observing that a single pair could produce a large number of offspring in a very short period, and he expressed wonder at the speed with which rodent populations could grow under favorable conditions. Aristotle also recorded various folk beliefs about rodents, including the belief that mice could be generated spontaneously from damp soil or decaying matter, a notion that would persist in Western thought for nearly 2,000 years. Aristotle's observations about rat and mouse reproduction were not merely academic. The explosive reproductive potential of rodents was a matter of serious practical concern in the ancient world. A single pair of rats under ideal conditions can produce dozens of offspring in a single year, and those offspring can begin reproducing themselves within a matter of weeks. This means that a small rat population can grow to enormous size in a very short time, overwhelming the food stores and sanitary systems of even the largest and most well-organized communities. The ancient Greeks, Romans, and other Mediterranean peoples experienced rodent population explosions, sometimes called rat plagues or mouse plagues, with devastating regularity, and these events left deep impressions on the cultural memory. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, recorded a remarkable story about the role of mice in the defeat of the Assyrian king Sennacherib's army during its invasion of Egypt. According to Herodotus, the Egyptian priests told him that on the night before the battle, a great swarm of field mice invaded the Assyrian camp and gnawed through the soldiers' bowstrings, quiver straps, and shield handles, rendering their weapons useless. When morning came, the disarmed Assyrians were routed by the Egyptians. This story, which may or may not have a historical basis, reflects the ancient perception of mice and rats as agents of divine intervention, capable of altering the course of history through their seemingly insignificant but cumulatively devastating actions. The ancient Romans, who built the largest and most powerful empire the Western world had ever seen, had a complex and well-documented relationship with rats. The Romans were, among many other things, great builders, great engineers, and great administrators, and their cities, roads, aqueducts, and granaries were marvels of organization and construction. But they were also environments that were extraordinarily hospitable to rats. The city of Rome itself, at the height of its power, was home to roughly 1 million people, a population density that would not be matched by any European city until the Industrial Age. This vast concentration of humanity, with its markets, its warehouses, its grain stores, its refuse heaps, and its labyrinthine sewers, was a paradise for rats. The Romans were well aware of the rat problem and took extensive measures to combat it. The Roman author and naturalist Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, devoted considerable attention to rodents in his encyclopedic Natural History. Pliny described various species of mice and rats known to the Romans, discussed their habits and behaviors, and recorded a variety of methods used to control their populations. These methods included the use of traps, poisons, fumigation, and cats. Pliny also recorded various folk remedies for rat bites and rat-borne ailments, some of which were practical and effective, and some of which were based on superstition and magical thinking. The Roman grain supply, known as the annona, was one of the most critical institutions of the Roman state. Rome imported vast quantities of grain from Egypt, North Africa, Sicily, and other provinces to feed its enormous urban population, and this grain was stored in massive warehouses called Horrea, which were located throughout the city and at the port of Ostia. Protecting these grain stores from rats, mice, weevils, and other pests was a matter of the highest priority, and the administrators of the annona employed a range of strategies to accomplish this goal. These strategies included the construction of Horrea with raised floors and thick walls, the sealing of grain in large ceramic vessels called dolia, the use of cats and weasels as biological pest control agents, and the employment of specialized workers whose job was to monitor the grain stores and deal with infestations. The Roman author Columella, who wrote a comprehensive treatise on agriculture in the 1st century of the Common Era, provided detailed advice on how to protect stored grain from rodents. Columella recommended the construction of granaries with smooth, plastered walls that would be difficult for rats to climb, the use of raised platforms to keep grain off the ground, and the application of various substances to the walls and floors of storage buildings that were believed to repel rodents. He also recommended the keeping of cats and weasels in and around granaries, and he discussed the relative merits of different approaches to rodent management. Columella's work is one of the most detailed and practical ancient texts on the subject of agricultural pest control, and it provides a vivid picture of the challenges that Roman farmers and administrators faced in their ongoing battle against rats. The Roman military, the most powerful and well-organized fighting force in the ancient world, also had to contend with rats. The great legionary fortresses and marching camps that the Romans built throughout their empire were provisioned with large quantities of food, including grain, dried meat, cheese, and other supplies, all of which were attractive to rodents. Archaeological excavations at Roman military sites across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East have revealed evidence of rat activity, including rat bones, gnaw marks on stored food containers, and the remains of traps and other pest control devices. The Roman military, with its legendary discipline and organizational ability, undoubtedly had procedures for dealing with rodent infestations, though the details of these procedures are not always well documented in the surviving texts. The ancient Romans also encountered rats in their homes, their temples, their public buildings, and their elaborate system of underground sewers. The Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer of Rome, which was originally constructed in the 6th century before the Common Era and remained in use for centuries, was an engineering marvel that helped to drain the marshy lowlands of the city and carry away waste water. but it was also a haven for rats, providing them with shelter, moisture, and access to food waste. The labyrinthine tunnels of the Roman sewer system created an underground highway for rats, allowing them to move unseen beneath the streets of the city and emerge wherever opportunities for food and shelter presented themselves. The Romans also kept rats and mice as objects of curiosity and even as pets, though this practice was not widespread and was generally confined to the upper classes. The dormouse, a small, fat rodent native to Europe, was a particular favorite of the Romans, who kept them in special enclosures called gloraria, fattened them on nuts and other foods, and served them as a delicacy at banquets. The fattened dormouse, or gleis, was considered a luxury food item in Roman cuisine, and recipes for preparing dormice appear in the famous Roman cookbook attributed to Apicius. While the dormouse is not technically a true rat, its culinary exploitation by the Romans illustrates the complex and sometimes surprising ways in which ancient peoples interacted with rodents. The spread of rats across the ancient world was intimately connected with the expansion of trade routes and the movement of goods between different civilizations. Rats are extraordinarily adept at stowing away on ships, in cargo holds, among bales of goods, and in the nooks and crannies of any vessel or vehicle that carries food. As the trade networks of the ancient world grew in scope and complexity, rats traveled with them, colonizing new territories and establishing new populations wherever human commerce took them. The great maritime trade routes of the ancient Mediterranean, which connected Egypt, the Levant, Greece, Rome, North Africa, and the Western Mediterranean in a complex web of commercial exchange, were also rat highways, carrying these creatures from port to port and coast to coast. The ancient Phoenicians, the great seafaring traders of the Eastern Mediterranean, who established commercial colonies and trading posts from Lebanon to Spain between roughly the 12th and 6th centuries before the Common Era, almost certainly carried rats aboard their ships. The Phoenician trading network was one of the most extensive and well organized in the ancient world, and Phoenician ships carried goods of every description, from cedar wood and purple dye to grain, wine, olive oil, metals, and manufactured goods. Rats attracted to the food stores aboard these ships would have been common stowaways, and when the ships reached their destinations, the rats would have gone ashore, establishing new populations in the port cities and trading colonies of the Phoenician world. The same process occurred along the ancient overland trade routes, most notably the Silk Road, that vast network of caravan trails and trading posts that connected the civilizations of China, Central Asia, Persia, India, and the Mediterranean world. The Silk Road, which was active in various forms for over 2,000 years, was one of the most important channels of cultural, commercial, and biological exchange in human history. Along with silk, spices, precious metals, and ideas, the Silk Road also carried rats. The caravans that traversed the deserts and mountain passes of Central Asia carried food supplies that attracted rodents, and the caravanserais and trading posts along the route provided shelter and sustenance for both humans and rats. The movement of rats along the Silk Road would have enormous consequences for the peoples of Eurasia, though the most devastating of those consequences, the great plague pandemics of the medieval period, lie beyond the scope of our present narrative. Let us now turn to the ancient world's understanding of rats as agents of disease. While the ancient peoples of the world did not understand the germ theory of disease, did not know about the bacteria and viruses that cause epidemic illness, and did not comprehend the role of rat-borne fleas in transmitting plague and other diseases, they were nevertheless astute observers of the natural world, and they noticed the correlation between the presence of rats and the outbreak of certain kinds of illness. This observation found expression in the religious, mythological, and medical traditions of many ancient cultures. We have already mentioned the association between Apollo, Smintheus, and plague in the Greek tradition. A similar association can be found in the ancient Near Eastern traditions, where rodent plagues were sometimes interpreted as divine punishments or warnings. In the Hebrew Bible, in the first book of Samuel, there is a remarkable passage describing a plague that struck the Philistines after they captured the Ark of the Covenant from the Israelites. The plague is described in terms that are consistent with an epidemic disease, and the Philistines, seeking to appease the God of Israel and end the plague, made golden images of tumors and of mice or rats, and sent them back to the Israelites along with the ark. This association between rats and plague in the biblical text is one of the oldest and most explicit references to the connection between rodents and epidemic disease in the ancient literary record. The ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, who practiced in the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era, wrote about epidemic diseases in terms that, while not identifying rats as a specific cause, reflected an awareness that environmental conditions, including the presence of animals and the state of sanitation, played a role in the outbreak and spread of disease. The Hippocratic texts describe various epidemic illnesses that swept through Greek cities and military camps, and while these descriptions are often too vague to allow a definitive modern diagnosis, some of them are consistent with diseases that are known to be associated with rats, including plague, typhus, and leptospirosis. The Great Plague of Athens, which struck the city during the Peloponnesian War in the year 430 before the Common Era and killed perhaps a quarter of the Athenian population, was described in vivid and horrifying detail by the historian Thucydides. The cause of the Plague of Athens has been debated by scholars and physicians for centuries, and candidates have included typhoid fever, smallpox, measles, typhus, and bubonic plague. If the Plague of Athens was indeed a form of typhus or bubonic plague, then rats may have played a role in its transmission, though this remains speculative. What is certain is that the crowded, unsanitary conditions of Athens during the siege, with its overflowing refugee population, its inadequate water supply, and its accumulation of waste and refuse, would have provided ideal conditions for a large and thriving rat population. In the ancient world, the line between medical knowledge and religious belief was often blurred, and the treatment of rat-related diseases frequently involved both practical remedies and ritual or magical practices. Ancient Egyptian medical papyri, for example, contain prescriptions for treating ailments that may have been caused or exacerbated by contact with rats, including skin infections, fevers, and digestive disorders. Some of these prescriptions are based on practical knowledge of herbs and other medicinal substances, while others involve incantations, amulets, and appeals to the gods. The ancient Egyptians, like most ancient peoples, believed that disease was caused by a combination of natural and supernatural factors, and their medical practices reflected this holistic worldview. The ancient world also recognized the destructive impact of rats on the broader environment, not just on human food stores. Rats are omnivorous and opportunistic feeders, capable of consuming a wide range of foods, including seeds, fruits, insects, eggs, and even small animals. In environments where rats were introduced by human activity, they could have a devastating impact on native plant and animal species, particularly on islands and in other isolated ecosystems. While the full extent of rat-caused ecological damage in the ancient world is difficult to assess from the available evidence, there are indications that ancient peoples were aware of the broader environmental impact of rodent populations. The ancient Greeks, for example, recorded instances of rodent population explosions that caused widespread destruction of crops and natural vegetation. The Greek author Aelian, writing in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, described several incidents of mouse and rat plagues in the Greek world, including cases where enormous numbers of rodents appeared suddenly, devoured the crops, and then disappeared or died off just as suddenly. Aelian attributed these events to divine providence or to mysterious natural forces, but his descriptions suggest that the ecological dynamics of rodent population cycles, with their boom and bust patterns driven by food availability and predation, were a familiar phenomenon in the ancient Mediterranean. The ancient Persians, who built one of the largest and most sophisticated empires in the ancient world, also had to deal with rats. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, which at its height stretched from Egypt and Libya in the west to the borders of India in the east, encompassed a vast diversity of environments and agricultural systems, all of which were vulnerable to rodent pests. Persian administrative texts from the Achaemenid period, written on clay tablets in the Elamite and Aramaic languages, include references to the management of grain stores and the prevention of spoilage and pest damage. The great palace complexes of Persepolis and Susa, with their elaborate storerooms and treasury buildings, would have required constant vigilance against rats and other pests. In the Zoroastrian religious tradition, which was the dominant religion of ancient Persia, rats and other creatures associated with dirt, decay, and corruption were considered agents of Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit who was the cosmic enemy of Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of truth and light. The Zoroastrian texts classify animals into categories of good and evil, with some animals being considered creations of Ahura Mazda and worthy of protection, and others being considered creations of Angra Mainyu and worthy of destruction. Rats, along with snakes, scorpions, and various insects, fell into the latter category. The killing of rats and other noxious creatures was considered a meritorious act in Zoroastrian ethics, a way of fighting against the forces of darkness and corruption and upholding the cosmic order. This Zoroastrian attitude toward rats is particularly interesting because it represents one of the earliest known examples of a religious tradition explicitly promoting the extermination of rats as a moral and spiritual duty. While other ancient cultures also sought to control rat populations, they generally did so for practical rather than spiritual reasons. The Zoroastrian approach, which elevated rat killing to the level of a sacred obligation, reflects the profound impact that rats had on the daily lives and imaginations of the ancient Persian people. The ancient world also saw rats used in various forms of divination and fortune-telling. In the Mesopotamian, Greek, and Roman traditions, the behavior of animals, including rats and mice, was closely observed and interpreted as a means of predicting the future or discerning the will of the gods. We have already mentioned the Babylonian omen texts, which included interpretations of rat behavior. In the Roman tradition, similar practices existed. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder recorded the belief that the gnawing of mice on sacred objects was a portent of disaster, and he cited several historical instances in which the appearance or behavior of rats was taken as an omen of impending war, plague, or political upheaval. One of the most famous examples of rat-related divination in the ancient world comes from the Roman tradition. According to several ancient sources, the behavior of sacred rats or mice was observed and interpreted by priests at certain temples and shrines. If the rats appeared healthy, well-fed, and active, it was considered a sign of divine favor and good fortune. If they appeared sickly, emaciated, or restless, it was taken as a warning of trouble ahead. While the details of these practices vary from source to source, and while some of them may be embellished or apocryphal, they reflect a genuine ancient belief in the significance of rat behavior as a form of divine communication. The ancient world's literary traditions are rich with references to rats and mice, often used as symbols, metaphors, and moral exemplars. We have already mentioned the Chinese poem, The Large Rats, and the Greek mythology of Apollo Smintheus. To these we can add the fables attributed to Aesop, the legendary Greek storyteller who is believed to have lived in the 6th century before the Common Era. Several of Aesop's fables feature mice and rats as central characters, and these stories have been told and retold for over 2,500 years. The most famous of these is perhaps the fable of the town mouse and the country mouse, in which a country mouse visits his cousin in the city, and is initially dazzled by the abundance and luxury of urban life, only to discover that it comes with constant danger and anxiety. The moral of the story, that a simple, peaceful life is preferable to a luxurious but dangerous one, has resonated with audiences across cultures and centuries, and it reflects an acute ancient awareness of the different ecological niches occupied by rats and mice in rural and urban environments. Another well-known Aesop's fable is The Lion and the Mouse, in which a tiny mouse, spared by a magnanimous lion, later repays the favor by gnawing through the ropes of a net that has trapped the great beast. This fable, with its message that even the smallest and seemingly most insignificant creatures can be of great value, reflects the ancient observation that the rat's ability to gnaw through almost any material could be both a curse and a blessing, depending on the circumstances. In the Indian literary tradition, rats and mice appear frequently in the ancient collections of fables and stories that form part of the vast corpus of Sanskrit literature. The Panchatantra, a collection of animal fables that is believed to have been composed in its earliest form sometime around the 3rd century before the Common Era, includes several stories featuring mice and rats. These stories, like the fables of Aesop, use rodent characters to illustrate moral and practical lessons about intelligence, cunning, cooperation, and the dangers of overconfidence. The Panchatantra was one of the most widely translated and influential literary works of the ancient world, and its stories, including those featuring rats, spread across Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe, influencing storytelling traditions in dozens of cultures and languages. The Hitopadesha, another ancient Indian collection of fables, also features rats and mice in several of its stories. One of the most famous is the story of the mice who held a council to discuss how to protect themselves from a cat that was terrorizing their community. One young mouse proposed tying a bell around the cat's neck so that its approach would always be announced. The proposal was greeted with enthusiasm until an old, wise mouse asked the crucial question, "Who will bell the cat?" This story, which has parallels in the European tradition as well, illustrates the ancient fascination with the relationship between rats and their primary natural predator, the cat, and with the broader themes of planning, courage, and the gap between theory and practice. The ancient world also saw rats used in various forms of art and decoration. Rats and mice appear in the art of many ancient cultures, though they are not as commonly depicted as larger, more prestigious animals such as lions, horses, eagles, and bulls. In ancient Egyptian art, mice are occasionally depicted in humorous or satirical scenes, such as the famous ostraca or decorated pottery shards from Deir el-Medina that show mice in various poses, sometimes engaging in activities that parody human behavior. One well-known ostracon depicts a scene in which mice are served by cats, a humorous inversion of the natural order that may reflect the ancient Egyptian taste for satire and social commentary. In ancient Greek art, mice appear on coins, pottery, and small decorative objects. The island of Tenedos in the Aegean Sea, which was associated with the cult of Apollo Smintheus, minted coins bearing the image of a mouse, reflecting the religious significance of rodents in the local tradition. Greek pottery painters sometimes depicted mice in genre scenes, and small figurines of mice have been found at various archaeological sites in the Greek world. In ancient Roman art, mice and rats appear in mosaics, wall paintings, and small sculptures. The famous Cave Canem, or Beware of the Dog, mosaics found at the entrances of Roman houses in Pompeii and elsewhere sometimes include depictions of other animals as well, and mice occasionally appear in these domestic contexts. Roman mosaics also depict scenes from daily life, including kitchen and dining scenes in which mice can be seen nibbling on fallen scraps of food, a realistic touch that reflects the ubiquity of rodents in Roman domestic life. The ancient world's understanding of rat biology, while limited by the absence of modern scientific knowledge, was nevertheless remarkably sophisticated in many respects. Ancient naturalists like Aristotle, Pliny the Elder, and the Chinese encyclopedists observed and recorded the physical characteristics, behavioral patterns, and ecological relationships of rats with a degree of accuracy that commands respect even today. They noted the rat's extraordinary reproductive rate, its omnivorous diet, its nocturnal habits, its preference for dark, enclosed spaces, its ability to swim, climb, and burrow, and its remarkable intelligence and adaptability. They also noted the rat's social behavior, its tendency to live in groups, its complex communication through vocalizations and scent marking, and its apparent ability to learn from experience and to teach its offspring. Aristotle, in particular, made several observations about rodent biology that were well ahead of their time. He noted that mouse populations could increase very rapidly under favorable conditions, and he speculated about the mechanisms that might control these population explosions. He observed that mice and rats were preyed upon by a variety of predators, including cats, weasels, snakes, and birds of prey, and he recognized the role of these predators in keeping rodent populations in check. He also noted that rodent populations could decline as rapidly as they increased, suggesting an awareness of the boom and bust cycles that characterize rodent population dynamics. The ancient Romans were particularly interested in the practical aspects of rodent biology, especially as they related to agriculture and food storage. Roman agricultural writers like Columella, Varro, and Palladius provided detailed advice on how to protect crops and stored grain from rats, based on their observations of rodent behavior and ecology. They recommended the construction of rat-proof granaries, the use of natural and chemical deterrents, and the employment of biological control agents such as cats and weasels. They also discussed the seasonal patterns of rodent activity, noting that rats and mice tended to be more active and more destructive at certain times of the year, particularly during the harvest season and the winter months when natural food sources were scarce. The ancient world's attempts to control rat populations represent one of the earliest and most sustained examples of human pest management. From the very beginning of agriculture, humans have been engaged in a constant battle against the rat, a battle that has employed an extraordinary range of strategies and technologies over the millennia. In the ancient world, the primary methods of rat control included physical exclusion, which involved building structures that were difficult for rats to enter or inhabit, trapping, which involved the use of various mechanical devices to capture or kill rats, poisoning, which involved the use of toxic substances to kill rats, biological control, which involved the use of natural predators such as cats, weasels, ferrets, and dogs to hunt and kill rats, and cultural and religious practices, which involved rituals, prayers, and sacrifices intended to appease the gods or spirits believed to control rodent populations. Physical exclusion was perhaps the most fundamental and widespread method of rat control in the ancient world. As we have already discussed, the builders of ancient granaries and storehouses employed a variety of architectural features designed to keep rats out, including thick walls, raised floors, sealed entrances, and smooth, unclimbable surfaces. The effectiveness of these measures varied, and no ancient structure was entirely rat-proof, but they represent a serious and sustained effort to manage the rodent problem through engineering and construction. Trapping was another common method of rat control in the ancient world. The earliest rat traps were simple devices, perhaps nothing more than weighted boxes or deadfall traps that crushed the rat when it disturbed a trigger mechanism. Over time, more sophisticated traps were developed, including cage traps that captured the rat alive, spring-loaded traps that killed the rat instantly, and adhesive traps that immobilized the rat on a sticky surface. Archaeological evidence for ancient rat traps is relatively scarce, as many of these devices were made of wood, leather, or other perishable materials that have not survived, but references in ancient texts and occasional surviving examples suggest that trapping was a widespread and well-developed practice. Poisoning was also used in the ancient world, though perhaps less commonly than trapping or biological control. The ancient Romans, in particular, were known to use various toxic substances to kill rats, including arsenic, hellebore, and other mineral and plant-based poisons. The use of poison for rat control, however, posed significant risks to humans, domestic animals, and the broader environment, and ancient writers were generally cautious about recommending it, often advising that other methods be tried first. Biological control, as we have discussed, was one of the most important and effective methods of rat management in the ancient world. The domestication of the cat, which occurred at least partially in response to the need to control rodent populations in and around human food stores, was one of the most consequential developments in the history of human-animal relationships. But cats were not the only biological control agents employed by ancient peoples. Weasels, ferrets, and certain breeds of dogs were also used to hunt and kill rats, and in some cultures, snakes were tolerated or even encouraged in and around granaries because of their ability to prey on rodents. The ancient Egyptians, in addition to their famous reverence for cats, also used snakes as a form of biological rat control. The Egyptian cobra, or uraeus, was a powerful symbol in Egyptian religion and royal iconography, but it was also a practical predator of rodents. Small, non-venomous snakes were sometimes tolerated in Egyptian homes and granaries because of their ability to catch and eat mice and rats. Similarly, the ancient Greeks and Romans recognized the value of snakes as rodent predators, and certain species of snake, particularly the large, non-venomous species of southern Europe, were considered beneficial animals because of their role in keeping rodent populations in check. The ferret, a domesticated form of the European polecat, was used by the ancient Romans as a hunting animal for rabbits and rodents. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder mentioned the use of ferrets for rabbit hunting, and it is likely that ferrets were also used to hunt rats in and around human settlements. The ferret's slender body, which allows it to pursue prey into narrow burrows and tunnels, makes it a particularly effective hunter of burrowing rodents, and its domestication may have been driven, at least in part, by the need to control rat populations in the ancient Roman world. We must also consider the role of rats in the ancient world systems of trade and exchange, not as commodities in themselves, but as accidental travelers and colonizers. The spread of the black rat from its original homeland in southern Asia to the rest of the ancient world is one of the most remarkable examples of biological invasion in human history. This spread was driven almost entirely by human activity, specifically by the expansion of maritime and overland trade networks that connected the civilizations of Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. The black rat, with its ability to climb ropes, cling to the rigging and superstructure of ships, and survive on the diverse food cargoes carried by ancient vessels, was the ultimate maritime stowaway. As ancient trade routes expanded and multiplied, the black rat spread with them, establishing populations in port cities and coastal settlements throughout the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the South China Sea. Archaeological evidence suggests that the black rat reached the eastern Mediterranean by at least the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, and possibly earlier. Rat bones from sites in ancient Israel, Jordan, and Syria have been dated to the Bronze Age, suggesting that the black rat was already present in the Levant 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. The spread of the black rat to the western Mediterranean and to Europe occurred somewhat later, driven by the expansion of Phoenician, Greek, and Roman trade networks. Rat bones from archaeological sites in Greece and Italy have been dated to the 1st millennium before the Common Era, and by the time of the Roman Empire, the black rat was established throughout the Mediterranean basin, from Spain and Morocco in the west to Egypt and Mesopotamia in the east. The Romans, with their vast empire, their extensive road network, and their massive maritime trade, were unwitting agents of the black rat's colonization of Europe, carrying these creatures to the farthest corners of the Roman world, from Britain and Germany to North Africa and the Black Sea. The colonization of new territories by rats had profound consequences for the human communities that lived in those territories. The arrival of the black rat in a new environment meant increased competition for stored food, increased damage to crops and property, and most ominously, the introduction of new diseases and disease vectors. The black rat is the primary host of the oriental rat flea, which is the principal vector of the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. While the great plague pandemics of later centuries, including the plague of Justinian in the 6th century and the Black Death in the 14th century, lie beyond the temporal scope of our present narrative, the groundwork for these catastrophic events was laid in the ancient world, as the black rat spread along the trade routes and established itself in the cities and towns of the Mediterranean and beyond. The ancient world's artistic and literary representations of rats, while varied and culturally specific, share certain common themes that transcend the boundaries of individual civilizations. One of the most persistent of these themes is the association of the rat with abundance and fertility, a seemingly paradoxical association given the rat's destructive reputation, but one that makes sense in light of the rat's extraordinary reproductive capacity. In the Chinese tradition, the rat is associated with wealth, abundance, and prosperity, and people born in the year of the rat are believed to be industrious, resourceful, and successful in financial matters. In the Indian tradition, the rat's association with Ganesha, the remover of obstacles and the god of new beginnings, links the rat to themes of creation, transformation, and renewal. Another common theme is the association of the rat with cleverness, cunning, and intelligence. In the fables and stories of many ancient cultures, the rat or mouse is portrayed as a clever trickster, a small creature that uses its wits to overcome larger and more powerful adversaries. This portrayal reflects the genuine intelligence of the rat, which is one of the most cognitively sophisticated of all rodent species. Ancient peoples observed the rat's ability to learn from experience, to solve problems, to navigate complex environments, and to avoid traps and other hazards, and they incorporated these observations into their stories and mythologies. A third common theme is the association of the rat with destruction, decay, and death. In many ancient cultures, the rat is seen as a harbinger of misfortune, a creature that brings disease, destroys food stores, and gnaws at the foundations of human civilization. This association reflects the genuine destructive impact of rats on human communities, an impact that was felt acutely in the ancient world, where the loss of a grain store to rats could mean famine and death for an entire community. These three themes, abundance, cleverness, and destruction, form the core of the ancient world's understanding of the rat, and they reflect the genuine complexity of the human-rat relationship. The rat was simultaneously a source of fascination and fear, a creature that was both admired for its intelligence and hated for its destructiveness, a symbol of both prosperity and pestilence. This ambivalence runs through the ancient world's representations of the rat like a thread, connecting the Chinese Zodiac to the Greek mythology, the Indian temple to the Egyptian granary, the Babylonian omen text to the Roman cookbook. As we close this first part of our exploration of the ancient rat, let us reflect on the sheer scale and significance of the story we have been telling. The rat is not merely a pest, not merely a nuisance, not merely a footnote in the grand narrative of human history. It is a central character in that narrative, a creature whose story is inextricably bound up with the story of human civilization itself. From the first agricultural settlements of the Fertile Crescent to the great cities of Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, China, Greece, and Rome, the rat has been there, a constant companion, a relentless adversary, and an unwitting shaper of human destiny. The ancient world's relationship with the rat was one of the most consequential ecological relationships in human history. It drove the domestication of the cat. It shaped the architecture of granaries and storehouses. It influenced religious beliefs and mythological traditions. It contributed to the spread of epidemic disease. It inspired works of art and literature that endure to this day, and it demonstrated with ruthless clarity the limits of human power and control over the natural world. For all their ingenuity, for all their architectural skill, for all their military might, the great civilizations of the ancient world were never able to fully master the rat. They could manage it. They could slow it down, they could reduce its numbers, but they could never eliminate it. The rat endured as it always has, as it always does, outlasting empires and civilizations, surviving catastrophes that destroyed everything else, adapting to every new challenge with a resilience that borders on the miraculous. The story of the ancient rat is in many ways the story of survival itself, the story of a creature that found its way into the most intimate spaces of human life and refused to be dislodged. It is the story of the unintended consequences of human progress, the hidden costs of agriculture, urbanization, and trade. It is the story of the complex, tangled, and often adversarial relationship between human beings and the natural world. And it is a story that, as we shall see in the second part of our exploration, has much more to tell us about the ancient world and the creatures that inhabited it. The archaeological record continues to yield new and surprising insights into the ancient history of rats. In recent decades, advances in zooarchaeology, the study of animal remains from archaeological sites, have allowed researchers to reconstruct the ancient distribution, diet, and behavior of rats with unprecedented precision. Techniques such as radiocarbon dating, stable isotope analysis, and ancient DNA extraction have opened new windows into the lives of ancient rats, revealing details that were previously invisible to scholars. These techniques have confirmed and expanded our understanding of the ancient spread of rats along trade routes, their diet and ecological impact in different environments, and their genetic relationships to modern rat populations. One particularly fascinating area of research involves the use of stable isotope analysis to reconstruct the diets of ancient rats. By measuring the ratios of different isotopes of carbon and nitrogen in ancient rat bones, researchers can determine what the rats were eating and, by extension, what foods were available to them in their ancient environments. This research has revealed that ancient rats, like their modern descendants, were extraordinarily versatile feeders, capable of consuming a wide range of plant and animal foods. In some cases, the isotopic signatures of ancient rat bones closely match those of the human inhabitants of the same sites, suggesting that the rats were eating the same foods as the humans, a finding that underscores the intimacy of the ancient rat-human relationship. Ancient DNA research has also provided new insights into the history of rat populations. By extracting and sequencing DNA from ancient rat bones, researchers have been able to trace the genetic lineages of ancient rat populations, map their movements across the landscape, and determine when and how different populations diverged from one another. This research has confirmed that the black rat spread from its original homeland in southern Asia to the rest of the Old World primarily through human agency, and it has revealed the existence of previously unknown genetic lineages and population movements. The ancient world also saw the development of various cultural and social practices related to rats that reflect the deep embedding of these creatures in human life and consciousness. In many ancient cultures, the sudden appearance of large numbers of rats was considered a sign of impending disaster, whether natural or political. Conversely, the disappearance or decline of a rat population was sometimes interpreted as a good omen, a sign that the gods were pleased and that prosperity was at hand. These beliefs reflect the intimate knowledge that ancient peoples had of the rat populations in their midst, a knowledge born of daily observation and interaction. In some ancient cultures, rats were associated with specific social groups or classes. In the ancient Roman world, the expression "to eat like a mouse" was used to describe someone who ate sparingly or frugally, while "to eat like a rat" implied greed and excess. These linguistic associations reflect the ancient observation of different feeding behaviors among different rodent species. with the smaller, more delicate mouse associated with modesty and restraint, and the larger, more aggressive rat associated with veracity and destruction. The ancient Egyptians, as we have noted, had a rich tradition of artistic and literary representations of rodents, and some of these representations suggest a surprisingly nuanced understanding of rat behavior and ecology. The satirical papyri in Ostraca from the New Kingdom period, which depict scenes of the world turned upside down, with mice and rats in positions of power and cats in positions of servitude, may reflect not only a taste for humor and social commentary, but also a keen awareness of the ecological dynamics that govern the relationship between predator and prey in the ancient Egyptian environment. The role of rats in the religious traditions of the ancient world is a subject that deserves particular attention, for it reveals the depths of the psychological and spiritual impact that these creatures had on ancient peoples. We have already discussed the cult of Apollo Smintheus in Greece, the association of Ganesha with the rat in India, and the Zoroastrian classification of rats as creatures of darkness and evil. To these, we can add several other examples from across the ancient world. In the ancient Near Eastern tradition, rats and mice were sometimes associated with underworld deities and with the realm of the dead. The gnawing and burrowing behavior of rats, which allowed them to penetrate into the earth and into sealed spaces, may have suggested a connection with the subterranean world of the dead, and the rat's nocturnal habits may have reinforced this association with darkness and the unseen. In some Mesopotamian texts, the appearance of rats in a house was interpreted as a visit from spirits of the dead, and special rituals were prescribed to appease these spirits and to protect the household from their malign influence. In the ancient Greek tradition, mice were sometimes associated with the god Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and the irrational forces of nature. This association may reflect the observation that mice were attracted to the fermenting grape must and wine stored in ancient Greek cellars and storehouses. The mouse's association with Dionysus is less well known than its association with Apollo, but it represents another facet of the complex and multivalent role that rodents played in ancient Greek religion and mythology. The ancient Japanese tradition, while somewhat later in its development than the civilizations we have been discussing, also includes a rich folklore about rats and mice that draws on very ancient cultural roots. In Japanese mythology, the rat is associated with Daikoku, one of the 7 gods of fortune, a deity of wealth, commerce, and abundance. This association, like the Chinese Zodiac's placement of the rat in the first position, reflects the perception of the rat as a creature of intelligence, resourcefulness, and prosperity. Japanese folklore includes numerous stories about magical or supernatural rats, including the Nezumi, or rat, of fairy tales, which can bring good fortune or cause mischief depending on its disposition. Throughout the ancient world, the rat served as a mirror for human society, reflecting back both its virtues and its vices. The rat's intelligence was admired, its persistence was respected, its resourcefulness was envied, but its destructiveness was feared, its association with disease was dreaded, and its seeming invincibility in the face of human efforts to control it was a source of frustration and despair. The ancient rat was, in a very real sense, humanity's shadow, a creature that thrived in the margins and crevices of human civilization, feeding on its surplus, exploiting its weaknesses, and enduring its wrath. And so, as we pause at the midpoint of our journey through the ancient history of the rat, we are left with a sense of awe at the sheer scope and complexity of the story we have been telling. We have traveled from the age of the dinosaurs to the fall of Rome, from the forests of Southeast Asia to the temples of Egypt, from the granaries of Mesopotamia to the philosophical schools of Athens. We have encountered rats in mythology and medicine, in agriculture and art, in religion and trade. We have seen how the rat shaped human civilization in ways both obvious and subtle, and how human civilization, in turn, shaped the evolution and distribution of the rat, and we have only just begun. The story continues in part 2, where we will delve deeper into the specific ways that ancient civilizations dealt with rats, explore additional myths and legends from cultures we have not yet touched upon, examine the forensic and archaeological evidence in greater detail, and consider the broader ecological and evolutionary implications of the ancient rat-human relationship. The tale of the ancient rat is far from over. In many ways, it is just beginning. Until then, remember that the history of the world is not just the history of kings and conquests, of empires and earthquakes, of gods and great men. It is also the history of the small, the humble, and the overlooked, the creatures that lived alongside us in the shadows, shaping our world in ways we are only now beginning to understand. The ancient rat is one of those creatures, and its story is one that deserves to be told, remembered, and respected. We return now to our journey through the ancient world, a world that was shaped in ways both grand and invisible, by a creature so small that it could fit in the palm of a human hand, yet so powerful in its cumulative impact that it altered the fate of civilizations. The rat. We have traced its origins from the age of the dinosaurs through the dawn of agriculture, through the rise of the first great civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, China, Greece, and Rome. We have seen how the rat followed humanity into its cities, its granaries, its temples, and its tombs. We have seen how it inspired gods and fables, how it devoured harvests and spread disease, and how it resisted every effort to eradicate it. Now, in this second and final part of our exploration, we go deeper. We examine the details that the broad sweep of history often overlooks. We explore the hidden corners of the ancient rat's world, the forgotten stories, the lost knowledge, and the silent archaeological evidence that, taken together, paint a portrait of one of the most extraordinary creatures ever to have shared this planet with human beings. Let us begin by returning to the question of rat biology and behavior in the ancient world, for it is in the intimate details of the rat's daily life that we find the keys to understanding its extraordinary success. The ancient rat was, above all else, a survivor. Its body was perfectly designed for survival in the most challenging and unpredictable environments. Its teeth, those ever-growing, self-sharpening incisors that are the hallmark of all rodents, were capable of gnawing through wood, bone, leather, dried mud brick, and even soft metals such as lead and copper. Ancient peoples marveled at and cursed this gnawing ability in equal measure. The destruction wrought by rat teeth on granaries, homes, clothing, and stored goods was one of the most persistent complaints in the administrative and literary records of the ancient world. The rat's teeth grew continuously throughout its life, a remarkable adaptation that ensured that they never wore down, no matter how much gnawing the rat did. This continuous growth was driven by the presence of stem cells at the base of each incisor, cells that produced new tooth material at a rate sufficient to replace whatever was worn away at the tip. This biological mechanism was, of course, unknown to the ancient world, but its effects were all too visible. Ancient builders learned through bitter experience that no material was truly rat-proof. Wooden granary walls could be gnawed through overnight. Leather sacks could be shredded. Clay vessels could be chipped and cracked. Even the thick mud brick walls of Mesopotamian storehouses, when left unplastered and unmaintained, could be breached by a determined colony of rats. The only materials that consistently resisted rat teeth were hard stone, fired ceramic, and metals such as bronze and iron, and the use of these materials in the construction of granaries and storage containers was, in part, a direct response to the destructive capabilities of the rat. The rat's digestive system was another key to its success. Rats are true omnivores, capable of digesting an extraordinarily wide range of foods, from grain and fruit to meat, fish, insects, and carrion. This dietary flexibility meant that rats could thrive in virtually any environment that contained organic material, which is to say, virtually any environment inhabited by human beings. In the ancient world, where food waste was far less efficiently managed than it would be in later periods, the rat found abundant sustenance in the refuse heaps, open markets, slaughterhouses, and kitchens of every human settlement. The rat's ability to eat almost anything also made it remarkably resistant to attempts at dietary control. Even when granaries were successfully sealed and food stores were protected, rats could survive by foraging in the broader environment, feeding on insects, roots, garbage, and other available resources. The rat's reproductive biology was perhaps the most alarming aspect of its biology from the ancient human perspective. A single female rat could produce as many as 5 to 7 litters per year, with each litter containing 6 to 12 pups. The pups themselves could begin reproducing at just a few months of age, meaning that a single pair of rats, under favorable conditions, could produce thousands of descendants within a single year. This explosive reproductive potential was noted with astonishment and dismay by ancient naturalists and agricultural writers, and it was one of the primary reasons that rat infestations were so difficult to control. No matter how many rats were killed or trapped, the survivors could quickly replenish their numbers, often within a matter of weeks. Aristotle, as we noted in the first part of our exploration, was particularly struck by the reproductive capacity of mice and rats. He wrote that mouse populations could increase so rapidly that they sometimes overwhelmed entire regions, consuming all available food and then dying off in great numbers when the food supply was exhausted. Aristotle described these population explosions as one of the great mysteries of nature, and he was unable to fully explain how they occurred. He speculated that the rapid increase might be aided by spontaneous generation, the belief that living organisms could arise from non-living matter, a concept that was widely accepted in the ancient world and would not be definitively disproven until many centuries later. While Aristotle was wrong about spontaneous generation, his observation of the boom and bust cycle of rodent populations was essentially correct and reflects a genuine ecological phenomenon that has been studied and documented by modern scientists. The social behavior of ancient rats was another factor in their success. Rats are highly social animals, living in groups that can range from a few individuals to several hundred, depending on the availability of food and shelter. Within these groups, rats establish complex hierarchies based on dominance, age, and kinship. Dominant rats have preferential access to food and mates, while subordinate rats are forced to forage in less favorable locations and may be excluded from the best nesting sites. This social structure, while sometimes leading to conflict within the group, also provides significant advantages. Social living allows rats to share information about food sources and dangers, to cooperate in the care of young, and to collectively defend their territory against intruders. Ancient peoples observed the social behavior of rats with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. The sight of a large colony of rats moving through a granary or along a city street was a common and deeply unsettling experience for the inhabitants of ancient cities. The rats' apparent coordination, their seeming ability to communicate with one another, and their collective behavior in the face of threats all contributed to the perception that rats were not merely dumb animals, but intelligent, calculating creatures with a kind of collective purpose. This perception found expression in the myths and stories of many ancient cultures, where rats were often portrayed as organized, purposeful beings, sometimes even possessing a form of society or government of their own. The intelligence of the rat was one of the most frequently remarked upon aspects of its nature in the ancient world. Rats are capable of learning complex tasks, remembering solutions to problems, and adapting their behavior in response to new challenges. They can navigate mazes, avoid traps that have caught other members of their group, and modify their foraging patterns to exploit new food sources. This behavioral flexibility made rats extraordinarily difficult to control, because they could quickly learn to avoid the traps, poisons, and other hazards that humans set for them. Ancient pest control specialists, whether they were Egyptian granary workers, Roman Horrea managers, or Chinese agricultural officials, were engaged in a constant arms race with the rat, developing new strategies and technologies, only to find that the rats adapted to them with frustrating speed. One of the most remarkable examples of rat intelligence in the ancient world was the phenomenon known as bait shyness, in which rats that had survived exposure to a toxic substance learned to avoid that substance in the future, even when it was disguised or mixed with attractive foods. While the term bait shyness is modern, the phenomenon itself was well known to ancient pest control practitioners, who noted that rats could not be fooled twice by the same trick. This observation led to the development of increasingly sophisticated poisoning strategies, including the use of slow-acting poisons that did not produce symptoms until long after the rat had consumed the bait, making it difficult for the rat to associate the bait with the illness. Whether ancient poisoners fully understood this principle is unclear, but the variety and complexity of the rat poisons described in ancient texts suggest that they had at least an intuitive grasp of the challenges involved. Let us now turn our attention to some of the specific ancient civilizations and regions that we touched upon only briefly in the first part of our exploration, and examine their relationship with the rat in greater detail. The ancient Levant, that strip of fertile land along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, encompassing modern-day Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and parts of Syria and Jordan, was one of the earliest and most important regions of human settlement and agricultural development. The Levant was a crossroads of the ancient world, a place where the trade routes of Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Mediterranean converged, and it was one of the first regions outside of Southeast Asia to be colonized by the black rat. Archaeological evidence from Levantan sites paints a vivid picture of the ancient rat's presence in this region. At the site of Tel Es Safi, identified by many scholars as the ancient Philistine city of Gath, excavations have revealed rat bones in contexts dating back to the Iron Age, roughly 3,000 years ago. The presence of rats at Gath is particularly interesting in light of the biblical narrative of the plague that struck the Philistines after they captured the Ark of the Covenant, a narrative that, as we discussed in the first part of our exploration, explicitly associates rats with epidemic disease. While it is impossible to say with certainty that the biblical account reflects a real historical event, the archaeological evidence for the presence of rats in Philistine cities lends a certain plausibility to the narrative and suggests that the ancient inhabitants of the Levant were well acquainted with the destructive and disease-bearing potential of these creatures. At other Levantan sites, including Megiddo, Hazor, Lachish, and Gezer, rat bones have been found in domestic, storage, and refuse contexts, confirming that rats were a widespread and persistent presence in the cities and towns of the ancient Levant. The fortified granaries and storehouses that have been excavated at these sites show evidence of the same kinds of anti-rodent measures that were employed in Egypt and Mesopotamia, including raised floors, thick walls, sealed entrances, and evidence of cat keeping. The ancient Phoenicians, those master seafarers and traders who dominated the maritime commerce of the eastern Mediterranean from roughly the 12th to the 6th century before the Common Era, played a crucial role in the spread of the black rat across the Mediterranean basin. Phoenician ships, which carried goods from the ports of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos to colonies and trading posts as far away as Carthage, Sardinia, Sicily, and the Iberian Peninsula, were perfect vehicles for the transport of rats. The holds of Phoenician merchant vessels were packed with amphorae of wine, olive oil, and grain, with bolts of dyed cloth, with ingots of copper and tin, and with all manner of luxury goods. These cargoes provided ample food and shelter for stowaway rats, and the long sea voyages of the Phoenician fleet gave the rats time to establish themselves aboard the ships and to breed during the passage. When the Phoenician ships reached their destinations, the rats went ashore with the cargo, finding new homes in the port cities and coastal settlements of the western Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence suggests that the black rat reached the western Mediterranean, including the islands of Cyprus, Crete, Sicily, and Sardinia, and the coasts of North Africa, Italy, and Spain during the first millennium before the Common Era, a period that coincides with the peak of Phoenician commercial activity. The Phoenicians, unwitting agents of biological invasion, thus played a key role in the spread of the black rat to regions where it had never before existed, with consequences that would unfold over centuries and millennia. The ancient Greeks, as we discussed in the first part of our exploration, had a rich and complex relationship with rats, a relationship that found expression in their mythology, their science, their medicine, and their daily life. Let us now examine some additional aspects of this relationship that we did not have space to explore earlier. The island of Delos, one of the most sacred sites in the ancient Greek world and the legendary birthplace of the god Apollo, was also home to a significant rat population. Archaeological excavations on Delos have revealed rat bones in contexts dating back to the archaic and classical periods of Greek history, and the island's position as a major commercial hub in the Aegean Sea, with its busy port and extensive warehouses, would have made it an ideal habitat for rats. The presence of rats on Delos, the sacred island of Apollo, is particularly intriguing given the association between Apollo and the mouse or rat through his epithet Smintheus. It is tempting to speculate that the cult of Apollo Smintheus may have had its origins, at least in part, in the practical need to control the rat populations that threatened the sacred granaries and offerings of the island's temples. The ancient Greek military, like the Roman military that followed it, also had to contend with rats. The long sieges that were a feature of ancient Greek warfare, such as the legendary siege of Troy and the historical siege of Syracuse, created conditions that were particularly favorable for rats. During a siege, both the besieging and besieged forces were dependent on stored food supplies, and the concentration of food in fortified positions attracted large numbers of rodents. The loss of food to rats during a siege could have serious military consequences, weakening the defenders and hastening the fall of the besieged city. Ancient military texts do not often discuss the problem of rats in explicit terms, but the logistical challenges of protecting food supplies during prolonged military operations would have been well understood by ancient commanders. The ancient Greek colony of Cyrene, in what is now eastern Libya, provides another fascinating case study of the ancient rat-human relationship. Cyrene was one of the wealthiest and most important Greek colonies in North Africa, founded in the 7th century before the Common Era and renowned for its production of silphium, a now extinct plant that was prized throughout the ancient world as a seasoning, a medicine, and a contraceptive. The agricultural wealth of Cyrene, based on grain production as well as silphium, would have attracted rats, and the colony's position as a major port on the North African coast would have exposed it to the constant arrival of new rats via maritime trade. The people of Cyrene, like their compatriots throughout the Greek world, would have employed the full range of available anti-rodent measures, from cats and traps to architectural defenses and religious supplications. The Hellenistic world, the vast cultural and political sphere that emerged after the conquests of Alexander the Great in the 4th century before the Common Era, saw the further spread of the black rat across new territories. Alexander's campaigns, which took his armies from Greece and Egypt to Persia, Central Asia, and the borders of India, opened new channels of trade and communication between civilizations that had previously been only loosely connected. The Hellenistic kingdoms that succeeded Alexander, including the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, the Seleucid dynasty in the Near East, and the various Greek kingdoms of Central Asia, maintained extensive trade networks that linked the Mediterranean world to India, Central Asia, and even China. These networks, which carried goods, ideas, and people across vast distances, also carried rats, further extending the range of the black rat and exposing new human populations to its destructive and disease-bearing potential. The city of Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great at the mouth of the Nile in the year 331 before the Common Era, was one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities of the ancient world. At its height, Alexandria was home to perhaps 500,000 people, drawn from every corner of the Mediterranean and beyond. It was a center of learning, commerce, and culture, home to the famous Library of Alexandria and the Pharos Lighthouse, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. It was also a major grain port, the primary point of export for the vast grain harvests of the Egyptian Nile Valley, which fed not only Egypt but also, during the Roman period, the city of Rome itself. The enormous granaries and warehouses of Alexandria, packed with millions of bushels of grain awaiting shipment, would have been among the most attractive habitats for rats anywhere in the ancient world. The rat populations of ancient Alexandria must have been staggeringly large, and the constant flow of shipping in and out of the port would have ensured a continuous exchange of rats between Alexandria and the other major ports of the Mediterranean. The Ptolemaic administration of Egypt, which governed the country for nearly 300 years after Alexander's death, was one of the most bureaucratic and detail-oriented governments in ancient history. The Ptolemies maintained elaborate records of grain production, storage, and distribution, and their administrative papyri contain references to the measures taken to protect the grain supply from spoilage, theft, and pest damage, including damage by rats and mice. The Ptolemaic granaries were built to high specifications, with thick walls, sealed entrances, and raised floors, and the administrators responsible for them were held accountable for any losses, including losses attributed to rodent damage. The severe penalties imposed on granary administrators who failed to protect their stocks from rats suggest that the problem was both serious and persistent, and that even the most diligent precautions were not always sufficient to prevent loss. Now let us travel further east, back to the ancient civilizations of South and Southeast Asia, where the story of the rat takes on new dimensions. The Indian subcontinent, as we discussed in the first part of our exploration, was home to a rich and varied tradition of rat-related mythology, religion, and folklore. Let us now examine some additional aspects of this tradition. In the ancient Jain religious tradition, which originated in India around the 6th century before the Common Era, the principle of ahimsa, or non-violence toward all living beings, extended to rats and mice as well as to all other creatures. The Jain monks and nuns went to extraordinary lengths to avoid harming any living being, including the smallest and most seemingly insignificant creatures. They swept the ground before them as they walked to avoid stepping on insects. They strained their drinking water to avoid swallowing microscopic organisms, and they tolerated the presence of rats and mice in their monasteries and temples, even when these creatures caused damage to their food stores and belongings. The Jain attitude toward rats represents one of the most extreme and philosophically consistent positions on the rat question in the ancient world, a position that elevated the life of the rat to the same moral status as the life of a human being. The ancient Buddhist tradition, which also originated in India around the 6th century before the Common Era, shared the Jain emphasis on non-violence and compassion for all living beings, though it did not carry this principle to quite the same extreme as Jainism. Buddhist texts contain numerous references to rats and mice, often in the context of parables and moral stories. In the Jataka tales, a vast collection of stories about the previous lives of the Buddha, several tales feature rats or mice as central characters, using their stories to illustrate principles of karma, compassion, generosity, and wisdom. One famous Jataka tale tells the story of a wise rat who saved his community from destruction through cleverness and self-sacrifice, a narrative that reflects the Buddhist admiration for intelligence, courage, and selfless devotion to the welfare of others. The ancient civilizations of Southeast Asia, including the Khmer Empire, the kingdoms of Java and Sumatra, and the early states of mainland Southeast Asia, all had to contend with rats, though the archaeological and textual evidence for their rat-related practices is less abundant than for the civilizations of the Near East and Mediterranean. The tropical climate of Southeast Asia, with its high temperatures and abundant moisture, was an ideal habitat for rats, and the rice-based agricultural systems that sustained the civilizations of this region were particularly vulnerable to rodent damage. Rice, the staple crop of Southeast Asia, was stored in granaries and storehouses that, like their counterparts in the Near East and Mediterranean, attracted large populations of rats. The methods used to protect rice stores from rats in ancient Southeast Asia are not well documented, but they likely included many of the same strategies employed elsewhere, including physical exclusion, trapping, biological control, and cultural and religious practices. The island environments of Southeast Asia present a particularly interesting chapter in the ancient history of the rat. Islands, by their very nature, are isolated ecosystems, and the introduction of rats to islands that had previously been free of these creatures could have devastating ecological consequences. The black rat, in particular, is known for its ability to colonize islands, where it can cause the extinction of native bird species, reptiles, and invertebrates that have no evolutionary experience with mammalian predators. While the full extent of rat-caused extinctions in ancient Southeast Asia is difficult to assess, there is evidence that the arrival of rats on certain islands coincided with the decline or disappearance of native species, suggesting that the ancient spread of rats along human trade routes had significant ecological consequences far beyond the immediate problem of food loss and disease. The ancient Pacific Island cultures, which were settled by seafaring peoples from Southeast Asia beginning roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, provide some of the most dramatic examples of the ecological impact of rat introductions in the ancient world. The Polynesian rat, known as Rattus exulans, was carried by the ancient Polynesian voyagers as they colonized the islands of the Pacific Ocean, from Fiji and Samoa to Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand. The Polynesian rat was smaller than the black rat, but it was equally adaptable and equally destructive. On islands that had been isolated for millions of years, with native species that had evolved in the absence of mammalian predators, the arrival of the Polynesian rat was an ecological catastrophe. On Easter Island, one of the most remote inhabited islands on Earth, the introduction of the Polynesian rat by the first Polynesian settlers, roughly 800 to 1,000 years ago, is believed to have played a significant role in the island's environmental collapse. The rats fed on the seeds and seedlings of the island's native palm trees, preventing the forest from regenerating and contributing to the deforestation that eventually stripped the island of its tree cover. This deforestation, in turn, led to soil erosion, the decline of agriculture, and the collapse of the sophisticated civilization that had built the island's famous Moai statues. While the role of rats in the collapse of Easter Island civilization is debated among scholars, and while human activities such as logging and agriculture were also major factors, the rat's contribution to the island's environmental degradation is supported by substantial archaeological and ecological evidence. In New Zealand, which was one of the last major landmasses to be settled by humans, the arrival of the Polynesian rat with the first Maori settlers, roughly 700 to 800 years ago, had a devastating impact on the island's native wildlife. New Zealand had been isolated from all other landmasses for roughly 80 million years, and its native species, including numerous species of flightless birds, ground-nesting birds, and large insects, had evolved in the complete absence of mammalian predators. The Polynesian rat preyed on the eggs, chicks, and juveniles of these defenseless species, driving many of them to extinction or near extinction in a remarkably short period. The loss of these species, which had taken millions of years to evolve, was one of the most significant ecological tragedies of the ancient world, and it was caused in large part by a creature that weighed less than 100 grams. The Polynesian peoples themselves had a complex and multifaceted relationship with the rats they carried with them on their voyages. In some Polynesian cultures, the Polynesian rat was considered a food source, and rats were hunted and eaten as a regular part of the diet. Archaeological evidence from Polynesian sites throughout the Pacific includes large numbers of rat bones bearing cut marks and burn marks consistent with butchering and cooking, confirming that rats were consumed as food. In other Polynesian cultures, rats were associated with spiritual or supernatural beliefs, and their presence or absence was interpreted as a sign from the gods. The deliberate transport of rats by Polynesian voyagers, whether as a food source or for other reasons, represents one of the most remarkable examples of the ancient human-rat relationship, a relationship so close that humans actually carried rats with them as they colonized new lands. Let us now return to the ancient Near East and Mediterranean and examine some additional aspects of the rat's role in ancient warfare, politics, and diplomacy. The use of rats and other animals as weapons of war has a long and disturbing history, and while the deliberate use of rats in this way is not well documented in the ancient world, there are tantalizing hints that ancient military commanders were aware of the potential for rats to cause damage to enemy food supplies and morale. The practice of biological warfare, broadly defined, has ancient roots. The poisoning of enemy water supplies, the catapulting of diseased animal carcasses into besieged cities, and the deliberate introduction of pests into enemy territory are all strategies that were employed, or at least contemplated, by ancient military commanders. Whether rats were ever deliberately used as a weapon of war in the ancient world is uncertain, but the idea is not far-fetched. A besieging army that could introduce a large population of rats into a besieged city's granaries would gain a significant strategic advantage, as the rats would consume and contaminate the city's food supply, hastening its surrender. Whether this strategy was ever actually employed is a question that the surviving evidence does not allow us to answer definitively, but the possibility is suggestive of the extent to which the rat had become embedded in the strategic and tactical thinking of ancient military planners. The ancient world also saw the development of legal and administrative frameworks for dealing with the problem of rats. In the ancient Near East, the law codes and administrative regulations of the Sumerian, Babylonian, Hittite, and Assyrian states included provisions relating to agricultural pest management, including the management of rodent pests. These provisions typically assigned responsibility for pest control to specific officials or to the farmers and landowners themselves, and they specified the penalties for negligence or failure to protect stored grain from spoilage and pest damage. The Roman legal tradition, which is one of the most detailed and well-preserved legal systems of the ancient world, also addressed the problem of rats, though typically in an indirect way. Roman law held property owners responsible for maintaining their property in good condition and for preventing nuisances that might affect their neighbors. A rat infestation that originated on one person's property and spread to the properties of neighbors could, in theory, give rise to legal liability, though the practical enforcement of such liability in the context of a problem as widespread and difficult to control as rats must have been extremely challenging. The ancient Roman institution of the aedile, a public official responsible for the maintenance of public buildings, streets, markets, and water supplies, may have had some responsibility for rodent control in public spaces, though the surviving evidence on this point is sparse. The aediles were responsible for ensuring the cleanliness and orderliness of the city's markets and public areas, and this responsibility would have included, at least implicitly, the management of pests that threatened public health and food safety. The Roman grain dole, the free distribution of grain to the citizens of Rome, which was one of the most important social welfare programs of the ancient world, depended on the integrity of the city's grain supply, and the officials responsible for administering the dole would have had a strong interest in protecting the grain from rats and other pests. Let us now consider the ancient world's knowledge of the different species and varieties of rats and mice, and their ability to distinguish between these different forms. The ancient naturalists, including Aristotle, Pliny the Elder, and the Chinese encyclopedists, recognized that there were multiple species of rodents, and they attempted to classify and describe them with varying degrees of accuracy and detail. Aristotle distinguished between several types of mice and rats in his zoological writings, noting differences in size, habitat, behavior, and diet. He described field mice, house mice, and larger rodents that may correspond to the black rat or to other large rodent species found in the eastern Mediterranean. Aristotle's classifications were based on direct observation and were for their time remarkably accurate, though they lacked the precision and systematic rigor of modern taxonomic systems. Pliny the Elder, writing several centuries after Aristotle, provided a more extensive catalogue of rodent species, drawing on both his own observations and the writings of earlier naturalists. Pliny described various types of mice and rats found in the Roman world, including the common house mouse, the field mouse, the dormouse, and larger rodents that he associated with specific regions or habitats. Pliny's descriptions, while sometimes fanciful or inaccurate, provide valuable information about the diversity of rodent species known to the Romans and about the ways in which these different species interacted with human communities. The ancient Chinese encyclopedic tradition also recognized the existence of multiple rodent species and attempted to classify them according to their physical characteristics, behavior, and ecological relationships. The ancient Chinese pharmacopoeia, which cataloged thousands of medicinal substances derived from plants, animals, and minerals, included entries for several different types of rats and mice, each with its own set of medicinal properties and uses. These entries, while reflecting the medical beliefs and practices of their time rather than modern scientific knowledge, provide valuable evidence of the diversity of rodent species known to the ancient Chinese and of the detailed knowledge that ancient Chinese scholars had of rodent biology and behavior. The ancient world's understanding of the rat's sensory capabilities was another area of knowledge that, while incomplete, reflected genuine observation and insight. Ancient naturalists noted the rat's keen sense of smell, which allowed it to locate food sources even when they were hidden or sealed. They noted the rat's acute hearing, which alerted it to danger and allowed it to communicate with other rats through a range of vocalizations. They noted the rat's excellent sense of touch, mediated by the sensitive whiskers or vibrissae on its face, which allowed it to navigate in complete darkness with remarkable precision. And they noted the rat's relatively poor eyesight, which made it dependent on its other senses for orientation and survival. These observations, scattered across the naturalistic writings of various ancient cultures, paint a picture of a creature that was exquisitely adapted to its ecological niche, a creature that could see in the dark, smell through walls, hear the approach of a cat from across a room, and feel its way through the narrowest and most labyrinthine passages with unerring accuracy. The rat's ability to navigate complex environments was particularly impressive to ancient observers. Rats are capable of memorizing the layout of their territory in extraordinary detail, learning the locations of food sources, nesting sites, escape routes, and danger zones with a precision that borders on the cartographic. Once a rat has learned the layout of a building, a granary, or a sewer system, it can navigate through it in complete darkness, at high speed, without hesitation or error. This navigational ability, which is based on a combination of spatial memory, sensory cues, and learned experience, made the rat an almost impossible quarry in the enclosed, complex environments of ancient cities and buildings. A rat that knew its way around a granary could evade traps, avoid predators, and find food with an efficiency that seemed almost supernatural to the ancient people who tried to catch it. Let us now explore the role of rats in the ancient world's artistic traditions in greater depth. We touched on this subject briefly in the first part of our exploration, but there is much more to be said. The rat, despite its generally negative reputation, was a subject of artistic representation in many ancient cultures, and these representations provide valuable insights into the ways in which ancient peoples perceived and interacted with these creatures. In ancient Mesopotamia, small figurines and amulets depicting rodents have been found at various archaeological sites. These objects, which are typically made of clay, stone, or metal, may have served as protective amulets, intended to ward off rodent infestations or to protect the wearer from rat-borne diseases. Alternatively, they may have been votive offerings, placed in temples or shrines as prayers for the protection of crops and food stores. The exact function of these objects is often difficult to determine from the archaeological context alone, but their existence confirms that rats were a subject of concern and attention in the daily lives of the ancient Mesopotamian people. In ancient Egypt, as we have already discussed, rodents were depicted in various artistic media, including papyrus drawings, pottery decorations, and carved reliefs. The famous satirical papyri from the Ramesside period, which date to roughly the 12th and 11th centuries before the Common Era, depict scenes of role reversal in which mice and rats take on the roles of humans and cats take on the roles of servants. One of the most celebrated of these scenes shows a cat serving as a nursemaid to a group of mouse children, while another shows mice hunting cats with bows and arrows. These images, which are among the most charming and amusing artworks to have survived from the ancient world, reflect a sophisticated sense of humor and a keen awareness of the ecological dynamics that govern the relationship between cats and rodents in ancient Egyptian life. The ancient Egyptian tradition of animal mummification also extended to rats and mice. Millions of animals were mummified in ancient Egypt, including cats, dogs, birds, crocodiles, and a variety of smaller creatures. Among these mummified animals, rats and mice have been found, though in much smaller numbers than the more commonly mummified species. Some of these mummified rodents may have been intended as offerings to specific deities, while others may have been the prey of mummified cats, placed in the cat's burial as a kind of eternal meal. The mummification of rats, whatever its specific purpose, reflects the deep integration of these creatures into the ritual and spiritual life of ancient Egyptian society. In the art of ancient Greece and Rome, rats and mice appear in a variety of contexts. Greek vase paintings sometimes depict mice in genre scenes, showing them nibbling on food or scurrying across surfaces. Small bronze figurines of mice have been found at Greek and Roman sites, and these objects may have served as decorative items, weights, or toys. The Roman tradition of decorating the floors of dining rooms with elaborate mosaics sometimes included depictions of discarded food scraps, crumbs, and even mice in a genre known as a serodos oikos, or unswept floor. These mosaics, which create a trompe l'oeil effect of a floor littered with the remnants of a meal, often include tiny mice feeding on the fallen crumbs, a realistic and somewhat whimsical touch that reflects the ubiquitous presence of rodents in Roman domestic life. The ancient Greek literary tradition also produced one of the most delightful and unusual works of literature about rats and mice in the ancient world, the Batrachomeomachia, or Battle of the Frogs and Mice. This short epic poem, which parodies the style and conventions of Homer's Iliad, tells the story of a war between the mice and the frogs, triggered by the accidental drowning of a mouse prince by the frog king. The poem depicts the mice and frogs arming themselves for battle, delivering speeches of defiance and bravado, and engaging in a fierce and chaotic combat that is ultimately resolved by the intervention of the gods. The Batrachomeomachia is a work of satire and comedy, poking fun at the heroic conventions of epic poetry by applying them to the absurd context of a battle between tiny creatures. But it also reflects a genuine ancient fascination with the world of small animals, a willingness to imagine the lives of mice and frogs as having their own dramas, their own heroes, and their own epic struggles. The ancient world's medical traditions, which we touched upon in the first part of our exploration, contain additional information about the role of rats in ancient healing practices. In the ancient Egyptian medical tradition, rat-derived substances were sometimes used in medicinal preparations, though the details of these preparations are not always clear from the surviving texts. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest and most important medical texts from ancient Egypt, dating to roughly the 16th century before the Common Era, contains hundreds of prescriptions for various ailments, some of which include animal-derived ingredients. While rats are not prominently featured in the Ebers Papyrus, the broader Egyptian medical tradition, as reflected in other papyri and medical texts, does include references to the use of rodent materials in certain preparations. In the ancient Greek medical tradition, the Hippocratic corpus, that vast collection of medical texts attributed to Hippocrates and his followers, contains references to various animal-derived substances used in treatment, and some of these substances may have included rat-derived materials. The ancient Greek physician Dioscorides, who lived in the 1st century of the Common Era and wrote one of the most influential pharmacological texts of the ancient world, De Materia Medica, included entries for various animal-derived substances, including some derived from rodents. Dioscorides described the medicinal properties of mouse dung, mouse blood, and other rodent materials, prescribing them for a range of ailments from skin conditions to digestive disorders. While these prescriptions may seem bizarre or repulsive to later sensibilities, they reflect the ancient medical principle that healing substances could be derived from any part of the natural world, including its most humble and seemingly insignificant creatures. In the ancient Chinese medical tradition, rat-derived substances were also used in medicinal preparations, as documented in the ancient pharmacopoeias and medical texts. The Shennong Benkao Jing, one of the oldest Chinese pharmacological texts, which is traditionally attributed to the legendary Emperor Shennong, and may have been compiled in its earliest form sometime during the Han Dynasty, includes entries for various animal-derived substances, some of which may include rat materials. The use of rat-derived substances in traditional Chinese medicine reflects the same holistic and comprehensive approach to healing that characterized the medical traditions of Egypt, Greece, and other ancient civilizations. The ancient world's understanding of the relationship between rats and water deserves special attention, for it was in the sewers, drains, and waterways of ancient cities that rats found some of their most important habitats. Rats are excellent swimmers, capable of treading water for extended periods and of swimming considerable distances. They can enter buildings through water pipes and drains, and they can survive immersion in water that would be fatal to many other small mammals. This aquatic ability made rats particularly well adapted to the urban environments of the ancient world, where networks of sewers, drains, and aqueducts provided an underground highway system that connected different parts of the city and offered shelter, moisture, and access to food. The great sewer systems of the ancient world, including the Cloaca Maxima of Rome, the drainage systems of the Minoan palaces of Crete, and the sophisticated underground channels of the cities of the Indus Valley, were all habitats for rats. These underground networks provided rats with a degree of protection from predators and from human pest control efforts that was not available in above-ground environments. A rat colony established in a sewer system could persist indefinitely, replenishing its numbers faster than they could be reduced by trapping or poisoning, and emerging at night to forage in the streets, markets, and homes of the city above. The ancient Romans, with their elaborate sewer system and their sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering, were particularly aware of the problem of rats in their underground infrastructure. The Cloaca Maxima, which was one of the largest and most complex sewer systems in the ancient world, was a haven for rats, and the Roman authorities took measures to manage the rat populations in the sewers, though the effectiveness of these measures is difficult to assess from the surviving evidence. The Roman author Frontinus, who wrote a treatise on the aqueducts of Rome in the 1st century of the Common Era, discussed the maintenance and management of the city's water supply system, including the need to prevent contamination by animals and other sources of pollution. While Frontinus did not specifically mention rats in this context, the broader concern with water quality and sanitation that his work reflects would certainly have encompassed the problem of rats in the city's waterways and drainage systems. The ancient world also saw the development of various folk beliefs and superstitions about rats that, while not scientifically accurate, reflect the deep impact that these creatures had on the human imagination. In many ancient cultures, the sudden appearance of a white or albino rat was considered an auspicious sign, a portent of good fortune or divine favor. Conversely, the appearance of a black rat in unusual circumstances, such as in a temple or a palace, was often interpreted as a bad omen. These beliefs, which varied from culture to culture, reflect the ancient tendency to interpret unusual natural phenomena as messages from the gods, and they underscore the extent to which rats had become embedded in the symbolic and interpretive frameworks of ancient societies. In some ancient cultures, rats were believed to possess magical or supernatural powers. In the ancient Near Eastern tradition, rat whiskers, rat bones, and rat blood were sometimes used in magical rituals and amulets, either to protect against rat infestations or to harness the rat's perceived powers of stealth, persistence, and survival. In the ancient Greek and Roman traditions, rats were sometimes associated with witchcraft and sorcery, and the ability to control or summon rats was considered one of the powers of the witch or magician. These beliefs, while rooted in superstition rather than science, reflect a genuine ancient respect for the rat's abilities and a recognition that this creature possessed qualities, intelligence, adaptability, and resilience that seem to transcend the ordinary capabilities of the animal world. The ancient world's experience with rats also shaped its attitudes toward cleanliness, sanitation, and public health. The association between rats, filth, and disease, while not fully understood in terms of germ theory, was intuitively grasped by many ancient peoples, who recognized that the presence of rats in a home, a granary, or a city was both a cause and a symptom of unsanitary conditions. This recognition led to the development of public health measures aimed at improving sanitation and reducing the conditions that attracted rats. The Roman public sanitation system, which included paved streets, public latrines, running water, and the elaborate sewer system, was motivated in part by the desire to create a cleaner, healthier urban environment, one that would be less hospitable to rats and the diseases they carried. The ancient Jewish tradition, as expressed in the Hebrew Bible and in later rabbinic literature, included detailed regulations governing cleanliness, food purity, and the management of contamination, including contamination caused by contact with rodents. The Levitical laws of the Hebrew Bible classify mice and rats among the unclean animals, creatures that were ritually impure and whose contact could render food, vessels, and people unclean. These laws, which govern the daily lives of the ancient Israelites and which continue to influence Jewish practice to this day, reflect an ancient awareness of the health risks associated with rodents and a desire to minimize contact between humans and these potentially dangerous creatures. The ancient world's knowledge of rats was also influenced by the practical experience of farmers, herders, and other rural people who lived in close contact with the land and its creatures. While the literary and scholarly traditions of the ancient world provide the most detailed and articulate accounts of the rat, the vast majority of ancient people who dealt with rats on a daily basis were ordinary farmers and laborers whose knowledge was passed down orally, from generation to generation, and was never recorded in written form. This folk knowledge, while largely lost to us, would have included a wealth of practical information about rat behavior, ecology, and control, information that was tested and refined over centuries of hands-on experience. The traces of this folk knowledge can sometimes be discerned in the agricultural and naturalistic writings of the ancient world, which often draw on popular wisdom and practical experience. The Roman agricultural writer Varro, for example, who wrote a treatise on farming in the 1st century before the Common Era, included advice on pest management that clearly reflects the accumulated experience of generations of Roman farmers. Varro recommended the use of smoke, strong-smelling substances, and various plant extracts to repel rats from granaries and storage buildings, advice that was likely based on folk practices that had been in use for centuries before Varro set them down in writing. The ancient world also recognized the economic impact of rats, not just in terms of the food they consumed, but in terms of the broader damage they caused to property, infrastructure, and commerce. Rats gnawed through the rigging and hulls of ships, causing leaks and structural damage that could endanger the vessel and its cargo. They gnawed through the walls and foundations of buildings, weakening structures and creating entry points for water and other pests. They gnawed through clothing, textiles, leather goods, and other valuable merchandise, destroying items that had required considerable labor and resources to produce. The cumulative economic cost of rat damage in the ancient world, while impossible to quantify with any precision, must have been enormous, representing a significant drain on the resources and productivity of every ancient civilization. The ancient world's efforts to quantify and manage the economic impact of rat damage are reflected in the administrative records of several ancient civilizations. In the ancient Egyptian administrative papyri, for example, there are records of grain losses attributed to spoilage and pest damage, and officials were held accountable for minimizing these losses. In the Roman administrative system, the managers of the great Horrea or grain warehouses were required to keep detailed records of the quantities of grain received, stored, and distributed, and any discrepancies, including those caused by rat damage, were subject to investigation and potential penalties. These administrative records, while often dry and bureaucratic in tone, provide valuable evidence of the seriousness with which ancient governments viewed the problem of rat damage and the measures they took to address it. Let us now turn to one of the most profound and far-reaching consequences of the ancient rat's relationship with human beings: its role in the evolution and spread of infectious disease. While we cannot discuss the great plague pandemics of later centuries in detail, as they fall outside the temporal scope of our narrative, we can and must examine the ancient foundations of the rat's role as a vector and reservoir of disease. Rats are hosts to a wide range of pathogens, including bacteria, viruses, and parasites, many of which can be transmitted to humans through direct contact, through the bites of rat-borne fleas and ticks, or through the contamination of food and water with rat urine and feces. The diseases associated with rats in the ancient world would have included plague, typhus, leptospirosis, hantavirus, rat bite fever, and various parasitic infections, though the ancient peoples who suffered from these diseases would not have understood their causes or mechanisms of transmission. The ancient world experienced numerous epidemic outbreaks that may have been caused or facilitated by rats and their parasites. We have already mentioned the plague of Athens, which killed perhaps a quarter of the Athenian population during the Peloponnesian War, and the biblical plague of the Philistines, which is explicitly associated with rats in the text of the first book of Samuel. To these, we can add several other ancient epidemics that may have had a rat-borne component. The so-called Antonine Plague, which struck the Roman Empire in the 2nd century of the Common Era, killing perhaps 5 million people and significantly weakening the empire's military and economic power, has been attributed by most scholars to smallpox or measles rather than to a rat-borne disease. However, the conditions of the Roman Empire, with its vast urban populations, its extensive trade networks, and its ubiquitous rat populations, would have been conducive to the outbreak and spread of rat-borne diseases as well, and it is possible that some of the epidemic outbreaks recorded in the Roman historical sources were caused by rat-associated pathogens. The plague of Cyprian, which struck the Roman Empire in the 3rd century of the Common Era and may have killed as many as 5,000 people per day at its peak, is another ancient epidemic whose cause remains uncertain. Some scholars have suggested that this plague may have been caused by a hemorrhagic fever virus, while others have proposed smallpox, measles, or other diseases. The involvement of rats in this epidemic is uncertain, but the conditions of the Roman Empire during this period, with its declining infrastructure, its deteriorating sanitation systems, and its growing rat populations, would have created an environment in which rat-borne diseases could flourish. Beyond specific epidemics, the constant, low-level burden of rat-borne disease in the ancient world would have had a significant impact on the health, productivity, and longevity of ancient populations. Leptospirosis, a bacterial disease transmitted through contact with water contaminated by rat urine, causes fever, headache, muscle pain, and in severe cases, organ failure and death. This disease would have been common in the waterlogged environments of ancient river valley civilizations, where rats were abundant and where humans were frequently exposed to contaminated water. Rat bite fever, caused by bacteria transmitted through the bite of an infected rat, would have been a constant risk for the inhabitants of crowded ancient cities where rats and humans lived in close proximity. And various parasitic infections, transmitted through the contamination of food with rat feces, would have been endemic in communities where food storage and preparation were carried out in rat-infested environments. The ancient world's attempts to deal with the health consequences of rat infestations were limited by the prevailing understanding of disease causation, which attributed illness to supernatural forces, to imbalances in the body's humors, or to the effects of bad air or miasma, rather than to specific pathogens transmitted by specific vectors. Nevertheless, many of the public health measures adopted by ancient civilizations, including the construction of sanitation systems, the regulation of food markets, and the promotion of personal hygiene, would have had the incidental effect of reducing the risk of rat-borne disease, even if the connection between rats and disease was not fully understood. The ancient Hippocratic medical tradition, for example, emphasized the importance of clean water, fresh air, and sanitary living conditions in the prevention of disease. While the Hippocratic physicians did not specifically identify rats as a cause of disease, their insistence on environmental cleanliness and their warnings against the health risks of overcrowded, unsanitary living conditions would have been relevant to the problem of rat-borne disease. Similarly, the Levitical laws of the Hebrew Bible, with their detailed regulations governing food purity, cleanliness, and the management of contamination, would have reduced the risk of rat-borne illness among the communities that observed them, even though the laws were motivated by religious rather than scientific considerations. As we approach the end of our exploration of the ancient history of the rat, let us pause to consider the broader lessons and implications of this extraordinary story. The ancient rat's relationship with human beings was, in many ways, a microcosm of the larger relationship between humanity and the natural world, a relationship characterized by both cooperation and conflict, by mutual dependence and mutual destruction, by adaptation and resistance. The rat taught the ancient world a hard but valuable lesson, that human civilization, for all its power and ingenuity, was not immune to the forces of nature. The greatest cities of the ancient world, the most magnificent temples, the most formidable armies, the most sophisticated bureaucracies, all were vulnerable to the depredations of a creature that could fit through a hole the size of a coin. The rat reminded the ancient world that the natural world was not a passive backdrop to the human drama, but an active participant in it, a force that could not be ignored or denied. The rat also taught the ancient world about the unintended consequences of its own actions. The development of agriculture, the growth of cities, the expansion of trade networks, all of these great achievements of human civilization also created the conditions for the rat's explosive growth and spread. Every granary was a rat's paradise, every ship was a rat's highway, every sewer was a rat's fortress. The very success of human civilization, its ability to produce and store surplus food, to build complex structures, and to connect distant regions through commerce, also created the ecological niches that the rat exploited with such devastating effectiveness. The ancient rat story is also a story about the power of adaptation. Over millions of years of evolution, the rat developed a suite of biological and behavioral traits: continuous tooth growth, omnivorous diet, rapid reproduction, social living, intelligence, and sensory acuity that made it one of the most adaptable and resilient creatures on the planet. When confronted with human efforts to control or eliminate it, the rat responded with adaptations of its own, learning to avoid traps, developing resistance to poisons, finding new routes into sealed granaries, and exploiting new food sources. The arms race between humans and rats, which began in the earliest days of agriculture and continued throughout the ancient world, was one of the longest and most sustained conflicts in the history of life on Earth, and it was a conflict in which the rat proved to be a remarkably effective and resilient adversary. The ancient rat story is, finally, a story about the interconnectedness of all life on Earth. The rat's relationship with human beings was not a simple, bilateral interaction, but a complex web of ecological connections that linked rats, humans, cats, dogs, weasels, snakes, fleas, bacteria, grain, and a host of other organisms in a network of mutual influence and interdependence. The domestication of the cat was driven by the need to control rats. The spread of rats was driven by the expansion of human trade. The outbreak of epidemics was facilitated by the concentration of rats in human cities. The extinction of native species on remote islands was caused by the introduction of rats through human colonization. Each of these connections was a thread in a vast and intricate tapestry of ecological relationships, a tapestry that stretched across continents and millennia, and that shaped the course of history in ways both obvious and hidden. The ancient civilizations that we have explored in this documentary, from Sumer and Egypt to Greece and Rome, from India and China to the Pacific Islands, all shared a common experience of living with rats. Despite their vast differences in language, religion, culture, and political organization, these civilizations all faced the same fundamental challenge: how to manage a creature that was too clever to be easily caught, too prolific to be easily reduced, and too adaptable to be easily excluded. Their responses to this challenge, which ranged from architectural innovation to religious ritual, from biological control to legal regulation, reflect the full range of human ingenuity and creativity, and they provide a fascinating window into the daily lives, the practical concerns, and the deepest anxieties of the ancient world. The rat, for its part, was indifferent to the achievements and aspirations of human civilization. It did not care about the great pyramids of Egypt, the hanging gardens of Babylon, the Parthenon of Athens, or the Colosseum of Rome. It did not care about the rise and fall of empires, the victories and defeats of armies, the creations and destructions of cultures. It cared only about survival, finding food, avoiding predators, and producing the next generation. And in this simple, relentless pursuit of survival, the rat proved to be more successful than any empire, more enduring than any monument, and more resilient than any civilization. The great civilizations of the ancient world have crumbled into ruins. Their languages have fallen silent. Their gods have been forgotten. Their emperors and kings are dust, but the rat endures. It endured through the fall of Sumer and the decline of Egypt. It endured through the collapse of Greece and the disintegration of Rome. It endured through the rise and fall of 100 kingdoms and empires whose names are no longer remembered. And it continues to endure, a living testament to the power of adaptation, the persistence of life, and the extraordinary resilience of one of the most remarkable creatures ever to have walked the earth. As we bring this exploration to a close, let us remember that the story of the ancient rat is not merely a story about a small, furry animal. It is a story about the foundations of human civilization, about the forces that shaped our world, and about the creatures that shared that world with us, whether we wanted them to or not. It is a story about the limits of human power, the persistence of nature, and the complex, tangled, and endlessly fascinating web of relationships that connects all living things. The ancient rat was there at the beginning, when the first seeds were planted and the first granaries were built. It was there when the first cities rose from the floodplains of the great rivers. It was there when the first ships set sail across the ancient seas. It was there when the first empires stretched their dominion across continents, and it was there when those empires fell, emerging from the rubble and the ruin to begin the cycle again. The ancient rat was, in a very real sense, the witness and the companion of human civilization from its very inception, a creature whose story is inseparable from our own. And that is the story of the ancient rat, a story of survival, a story of adaptation. A story of the small and the seemingly insignificant shaping the course of history. A story that deserves to be told, to be remembered, and to be understood. For in understanding the ancient rat, we understand something profound about ourselves, about our strengths and our vulnerabilities, about our achievements and our failures, about the world we have built and the world that was here before us, a world that in the end we share with creatures far older, far more resilient, and far more enduring than we may ever be. This has been the complete story of the ancient rat. A creature of shadows and grain stores, of sewers and temples, of myths and medicine, of war and worship. A creature that, for all its small size and humble appearance, played a role in the history of the world that was nothing short of monumental. And it is a story that we hope will inspire you to look at the world around you with new eyes, to see the hidden forces that shape our lives, and to appreciate the extraordinary, improbable, and endlessly fascinating drama of life on Earth. Thank you for watching. And remember, the smallest creatures often leave the largest footprints in the sands of history.